I mortgaged my home to give my daughter the wedding she begged for. Then she banned me and snapped that I needed to send $42,000 for a honeymoon in Dubai. I nearly wired it until the banker showed me a second mortgage bearing my forged signature. My name is Harold Jenkins. Everyone around here calls me Hal. I am 68 years old. For 40 years, I breathed in heavy exhaust fumes and scrubbed thick black grease out from under my fingernails so I could pay off my modest 3-bedroom house in Charlotte, North Carolina. I spent my entire life fixing massive diesel engines for the freight companies. I know exactly how heavy machinery breaks down, and I know exactly how to put it back together using leverage and sweat. But absolutely nothing in my 4 decades of hard labor could have prepared me to fix the broken look in my daughter Lauren's eyes when she sat across from me at my worn kitchen table, sobbing into her trembling hands. It was exactly 3 months before her wedding day. She was marrying Trent Caldwell. Trent was a polished and arrogant junior wealth manager at a high-end downtown firm. He was a man who wore custom Italian suits that cost more than my first pickup truck. He came from a family of old money that practically owned the most exclusive country club in the county. And from the very first moment I met them, I knew they despised everything about me and the life I had built. I remember the engagement dinner clearly. Victoria Caldwell hosted it at her sprawling estate. Victoria was Trent's mother. She lived in a gated neighborhood where the lawns looked like perfectly manicured golf courses, and the driveways were lined with imported stone. I showed up to that dinner in my best suit. I had bought it at a department store 10 years prior for a funeral. I made sure it was dry cleaned and pressed. I scrubbed my hands with heavy pumice soap for over an hour before leaving my house, but you can never truly wash away 4 decades of diesel grease. The black oil stains the deep lines of your palms permanently. Victoria noticed it immediately. She did not even offer her hand when I walked through her massive double doors. She looked down at my scuffed boots, then up at my frayed collar, and she handed me a drink with a tight and plastic smile. Throughout that entire dinner, Victoria made little calculated comments meant to cut me down. She asked in a sickly sweet voice if I found the drive up her long driveway confusing. She asked if my neighborhood was safe at night or if I had to worry about burglaries. Trent just sat there at the head of the long dining table, swirling his expensive red wine and laughing quietly at his mother's subtle insults. And Lauren, my beautiful and smart girl, she just looked down at her porcelain plate. She was so desperate to fit into their wealthy world that she let them walk all over mine. I swallowed my heavy pride that night. I chewed on dry roasted chicken and kept my mouth completely shut because I loved my daughter more than I cared about my own ego. Now Lauren was sitting in my small kitchen crying so hard she could barely breathe. The wedding planning had become a total nightmare for her. She told me Victoria was threatening to boycott the ceremony entirely if it was not held at the grand ballroom of the Caldwell Family Country Club. Victoria expected a premium open bar for 300 guests, a 5-course plated dinner, imported floral arrangements from overseas, and a live 12-piece orchestra. Lauren looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and told me Trent was deeply embarrassed by our budget. He had told her that his wealthy clients and senior colleagues were attending the ceremony, and a cheap wedding would completely ruin his professional image at the firm. They needed $100,000 in cash right away to cover the venue deposit and the luxury caterers. $100,000. I felt the air completely leave my lungs when she said that number. I raised Lauren completely alone since she was a young teenager. My wife Diane passed away from an aggressive breast cancer when Lauren was just 14 years old. Diane was the absolute light of my life. She was a gentle and kind soul who saw past my rough blue collar edges and deeply loved the hard-working man underneath. When Diane was in the hospital, wasting away in a sterile and cold bed during her final days, she made me promise her one specific thing. She held my calloused hand tightly in her weak fingers, looked me dead in the eye, and told me to always make our little girl happy. She told me to protect Lauren's smile at all costs, no matter what it took. I promised her I would. I promised on my own life and my own soul. And looking at Lauren, now completely broken and terrified by the demands of a snobby family that did not even respect her, I felt the massive and heavy weight of that deathbed promise pressing down on my chest, like a physical anvil. Lauren reached across the table and grabbed my rough hands. She begged me to help her. She promised me over and over again that she would pay me back every single penny. She said Trent was expecting a massive performance bonus at the end of the year from his wealth management firm, but they just needed the liquid cash right now to secure the vendors before the deadlines passed. She cried that her entire future and her marriage with Trent depended on this one event. If she embarrassed his family now, Victoria would never ever accept her into their circle. She would always just be the grease-stained mechanic's poor daughter. I saw the raw and agonizing fear of rejection burning in her eyes. I did not want her to feel like she was not good enough for them. I wanted her to walk down that grand aisle feeling like a queen. I wanted Diane to look down from heaven and see our daughter shining brighter than anyone else in that room. I told Lauren to wipe her tears. I told her not to worry about a thing because her father would take care of it. I did not tell her that I had only $20,000 left in my life savings account. I did not tell her that my modest retirement pension was barely enough to keep the lights on and put hot food on my table each week. I just patted her shaking hand and let her believe everything was fine. The very next morning, I drove my old Ford truck down to the local bank branch in town. I sat in a freezing cold office across from a young loan officer. I reached into my jacket and handed over the original paper deed to my house. The house Diane and I had scraped and saved for years to pay off early. The house where we brought Lauren home from the hospital as a newborn baby. It was my only real financial asset in the world. It was my only safety net for my declining old age. But a father's deep love does not calculate financial risk. A father's love only sees the immediate need to protect his child from pain. I took out a massive mortgage for $100,000 against the fully paid equity of my home. I signed the towering stack of legal papers with a steady and resolute hand. I did not hesitate for a single second. I convinced myself that Trent would pay me back exactly like Lauren had promised. He was a professional wealth manager after all. He handled millions of dollars for rich clients every single day. Surely he would honor his word and repay his father-in-law. The bank processed the loan and issued me a certified cashier's check 2 days later. I stood in the bank lobby holding that small rectangular piece of paper in my calloused hands. That check represented 40 years of breathing toxic exhaust fumes. It represented years of crawling under massive 18-wheeler trucks in the freezing rain and boiling summer heat. It represented decades of missing holidays to work double shifts just to survive. It was my blood, my sweat, and my tears printed neatly on a bank draft. I called Trent immediately and asked him to meet me in person. He chose a high-end artisan coffee shop in the wealthy downtown district. I walked inside wearing my standard work jeans and a faded flannel shirt. Trent was sitting at a corner table wearing a custom-tailored suit, sipping an expensive espresso. He looked up at me with that same arrogant amusement he always carried, looking at me like I was a stray dog that had accidentally wandered into a fancy restaurant. I sat down across from him without ordering anything. I reached into my chest pocket, pulled out the white envelope, and slid it slowly across the small table. I told him this was for the venue and the luxury caterers. I told him it was everything I had in the world. I looked him dead in the eye and said he needed to take care of my daughter and give her the beautiful day she deserved. Trent opened the envelope and pulled out the check. When he saw the $100,000 amount, his eyes widened in surprise for a fraction of a second. But he very quickly masked it with a smooth and practiced corporate smile. He folded the check and slipped it into the inside pocket of his expensive jacket. He leaned forward and told me I was doing the right thing. He said Victoria would be very pleased with this contribution, and that Lauren would finally have a wedding suitable for their elite social circle. He confidently assured me he would handle all the vendors personally. He boasted that a man in his financial position had the right connections to make the money go far. He promised me he would take care of everything, and I trusted him. I trusted him because he was going to be my son-in-law, and because I honestly thought no man on earth would dare steal from the father of his own bride. I was a blind and trusting fool. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a chaotic blur. Lauren was constantly busy with dress fittings, cake tastings, and rehearsals that I was never once invited to attend. Victoria Caldwell took over the wedding planning entirely. Every single time I called Lauren to ask how things were going, she was rushed and distracted. She sounded exhausted and stressed, but she always repeated that Trent had everything completely under control. I stayed out of their way. I figured my rough blue-collar manners would only cause unnecessary friction with Victoria, so I kept my distance and let them work. I focused entirely on getting myself ready for the big day. I went to a formal shop and rented a classic tuxedo. I made sure to pay extra to get it tailored perfectly so it fit my broad shoulders right. I bought brand new dress shoes and polished them until they shined. I wanted to look dignified for my daughter. I wanted to walk my little girl down that long aisle and show the snobby Caldwell family that a blue-collar mechanic could stand tall and proud among them. I spent those final evenings sitting alone on my front porch, looking out at my quiet and peaceful neighborhood. I could feel the heavy weight of the new mortgage settling in my gut, a deep financial anxiety, but I forced it down. I walked through the empty rooms of my house, running my hands over the walls I had painted myself. I remembered Diane's sweet laughter echoing down the hallway. I stood in Lauren's old childhood bedroom, looking at the floorboards where she used to play. I spoke to Diane's framed photograph on my nightstand and told her that our girl was going to be absolutely beautiful. I told her I had kept my promise. I had sacrificed my own financial security so Lauren could have her ultimate dream. I deeply believed that when you give everything you have to your family, they will cherish you for it. I believed that parental sacrifice was a shield against betrayal. I did not know yet that true evil does not care about your sacrifice. Evil just sees an open opportunity to take everything you have. The morning of the wedding finally arrived. I woke up hours before the sun even crested the horizon. I showered and shaved with extra meticulous care. I put on my tailored rented tuxedo piece by piece. I stood in front of the hallway mirror and carefully adjusted my black bow tie. I looked down at my hands. The grease stains were still there, faint dark shadows trapped forever under the skin, marking me as a lifelong laborer. But today, I was not just a dirty mechanic. I was the proud father of the bride. I was the man who had secretly funded the biggest society event of the season. I felt a quiet and swelling pride expanding in my chest. I walked out to my old Ford truck in the crisp morning air. I wiped a small speck of dust off the hood and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine and listened to the familiar, comforting rumble of the diesel motor. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the prestigious country club located on the wealthiest side of the city. The sky was perfectly clear and bright blue. It felt like a perfect day for a new beginning. I had absolutely no idea I was driving straight into a calculated nightmare. I had no idea that my own flesh and blood had laid a trap that would strip me of my dignity, my home, and my heart. The grease on my hands was nothing compared to the absolute filth I was about to uncover. The sun was just beginning to peek over the Carolina pine trees when I pulled my old Ford truck onto the main highway. The sky was painted in soft strokes of pink and gold. It was a beautiful morning for a wedding. I had been awake since 3:00 in the morning. I could not sleep a single wink. My heart was beating with a heavy rhythm full of pride and a deep, bittersweet sorrow. Today was the day I was going to give away my only daughter. Today was the day Lauren would walk down the aisle and start her new life. I looked down at my hands gripping the steering wheel. I had spent 2 entire hours scrubbing them with a harsh bristle brush and heavy pumice soap. I scrubbed until my skin was raw and burning desperately, trying to get the permanent diesel grease out of the deep creases of my palms. I wanted to look completely perfect for her. I wanted to be a father she could be genuinely proud of when she introduced me to Trent's wealthy friends. I was wearing the rented black tuxedo. It was a classic cut. It might have been slightly outdated compared to the custom Italian suits Trent and his colleagues wore, but I felt dignified. I felt like a gentleman. I reached over and touched the passenger seat. I had placed a small framed photograph of Diane right there on the worn upholstery. I wanted to feel like my late wife was riding with me to the venue. I spoke to the empty air in the cab of my truck. I told Diane that our little girl was going to have the most beautiful day of her life. I told her that I had kept my deathbed promise to her. I had sacrificed my own home, my absolute last financial safety net, to make sure Lauren had the $100,000 wedding she begged for. I did not care about the massive mortgage debt I had secretly taken on. The only thing that mattered was seeing the pure joy shining in my daughter's eyes. The drive to the Caldwell Family Country Club took 45 minutes. The club was located in the most exclusive part of the county, nestled behind towering oak trees and perfectly manicured hedges. As I drove up the long, winding access road, I felt a slight knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. My old rusty truck rattled loudly, completely out of place among the luxury imported cars and sleek black SUVs making their way toward the venue. I ignored the condescending looks from the other drivers. I sat up perfectly straight. I reminded myself that I had paid for this entire grand event. My blood, my sweat, and my tears had funded every single imported flower and every drop of premium champagne. I had earned the right to be there. I approached the massive wrought iron gates of the country club. There was a small guardhouse made of polished stone. 3 private security guards were standing out front wearing crisp white shirts and black ties. They were checking the names of the arriving guests on digital tablets. I pulled my truck up to the gate and rolled down my window. The cool morning air rushed in. I offered a warm and friendly smile to the closest guard. I told him my name was Harold Jenkins and that I was the father of the bride. The guard did not smile back. He looked at my truck with a blank and professional expression. He tapped his finger against his tablet screen. He scrolled down a long list of names. He stopped and frowned. He looked at me again, then back at his screen. He told me that my name was not on the approved guest list. I let out a soft chuckle. I told him there must be some kind of clerical mistake. I explained that Lauren was my daughter and that I was supposed to walk her down the aisle in exactly 2 hours. I kindly asked him to check the list one more time or to call the main clubhouse and speak to the wedding planner. The guard shook his head firmly. He stepped back from my truck and signaled to his 2 partners. The other guards immediately stepped forward, placing their hands on their utility belts. The lead guard told me that there was no mistake. He stated very clearly that he had strict orders not to let me pass through those gates under any circumstances. My friendly smile completely melted away. A cold and sharp wave of panic washed over me. I did not understand what was happening. I thought perhaps Victoria Caldwell had made an error with the seating charts. I thought maybe she had deliberately left my name off the list just to humiliate me and make me wait outside like a common delivery driver. I unbuckled my seatbelt. I told the guards I was going to park my truck to the side and walk up to the clubhouse to sort things out myself. The lead guard immediately raised his hand and ordered me to stay inside my vehicle. He told me that if I stepped out of the truck, he would have me arrested for trespassing on private property. The sheer aggression in his voice left me completely stunned. I was the father of the bride. I had mortgaged my house to pay for this wedding, and now I was being treated like a dangerous criminal at the front gate. Before I could argue any further, a sleek silver sports car pulled up to the security checkpoint from the inside of the country club grounds. The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. It was Preston Caldwell. He was Trent's older brother. Preston was a slick and fast-talking local real estate attorney. He wore an expensive gray suit that fit him perfectly. He had the same arrogant and polished look as Trent, but Preston always carried a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He walked slowly toward my truck with his hands resting casually in his pockets. He looked at my rented tuxedo and my old truck with a look of absolute disgust. I leaned out the window. I asked Preston what was going on. I asked him to tell the security guards to let me inside so I could see Lauren. Preston did not say a word at first. He just stood there and stared at me like I was a piece of trash that had washed up on his pristine driveway. He reached into the inside pocket of his expensive suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp white envelope. He handed it to me through the open window of my truck. He told me to read it, and then to turn my rusty piece of junk around and leave the premises immediately. I took the envelope with trembling fingers. My name was written on the front, in a familiar handwriting. It was Lauren's handwriting. I tore the envelope open. I pulled out a single sheet of thick, expensive stationery paper. The words on the page were short, but they hit me harder than a physical punch to the face. The letter started by saying she was sorry, but that she had to make a very difficult decision for the sake of her future. Lauren wrote that she could not have me at the wedding. She stated clearly that my rough aesthetic and my unpolished blue-collar manners would completely embarrass her in front of Trent's high society network. She wrote that she needed everything to be flawless to impress the senior partners at Trent's wealth management firm, and that having a grease-stained mechanic walking her down the aisle would ruin their pristine image. The final sentence of the letter completely shattered my soul. She wrote that she was banning me from the chapel and the reception, and that I should just go home and wait for her to call me after the honeymoon. I sat there in the cab of my truck, staring at the words until my vision blurred with thick, heavy tears. My own daughter. The little girl I had raised completely alone. The child I had sacrificed my entire life to protect. She was ashamed of me. She was so desperate to fit in with a family of snobby elites that she was willing to ban her own father from her wedding day. The very same wedding day that I had just secretly mortgaged my home to pay for. I felt a crushing, agonizing pain exploding in the center of my chest. It felt like my heart had been ripped out of my ribs. I looked up at Preston. He was smiling. It was a cruel, satisfied smirk. He told me I was pathetic. He told me to drive away before he called the local police and had me forcibly removed for ruining his brother's special day. I did not argue. I did not scream. The heartbreak was so absolute and so utterly paralyzing that I literally could not speak a single word. I carefully folded the letter and placed it in my jacket pocket. I put the truck in reverse. I slowly backed away from the grand iron gates of the country club. I drove down the road for about a quarter of a mile until I found a small dirt pull off near a grove of thick trees. I pulled the truck over. I turned off the engine. I rested my forehead against the cold, hard plastic of the steering wheel. And I wept. I wept with a deep, guttural agony that tore through my throat. I apologized to Diane. I cried out to my late wife, telling her that I had failed. I told her that our daughter had traded genuine love for plastic wealth. I sat in that dirt pull-off for nearly 2 hours. The sun rose higher in the sky. The day grew warmer. The initial wave of paralyzing sorrow slowly began to recede, leaving behind a hollow and cold numbness. I wiped my eyes with a rough handkerchief. I told myself I needed to go back to my empty house and figure out how I was going to pay off a massive $100,000 mortgage for a wedding I was not even allowed to attend. I reached for the ignition key, but something caught my eye through the trees. From where I was parked, I had a clear line of sight to the back service entrance of the country club. I watched as a small convoy of commercial vehicles pulled up to the rear security gate. I recognized them immediately as catering trucks, but something was completely wrong. When I had handed Trent the cashier's check for $100,000, he had promised to hire the most exclusive luxury catering company in the entire state. He had shown me their brochure. They used sleek, black refrigerated trucks with elegant gold lettering on the side. The trucks pulling up to the back gate were not sleek or black. They were old, beaten-up white box trucks. The sides of the trucks were covered in bright red and yellow decals. I squinted my eyes to read the logo. It was a company called Big Al's Discount Diner. It was a cheap run-of-the-mill local diner chain known for serving greasy bulk food at rock-bottom prices. They were the kind of caterers you hired for a casual backyard barbecue on a tight budget, not for a luxury country club wedding with 300 high society guests. I sat up straight in my seat. The heavy fog of my depression instantly lifted, replaced by a sharp, piercing spike of confusion. I rolled down my window and watched intently. The drivers got out of the trucks. They began unloading large aluminum trays of food. It was clearly cheap, bulk-prepared meals. There were no imported floral arrangements. There was no premium open bar being delivered. There was absolutely nothing that looked like it cost $100,000. My mind began to race with a frantic, cold logic. I knew exactly how much things cost in the real world. A discount diner catering a wedding for 300 people would cost $10,000 at the absolute most. The country club venue rental for a morning ceremony would not exceed $15,000. The numbers were spinning violently in my head. If they were using cheap vendors for the food and the setup, the total cost of this entire event was $25,000. Where did the rest of the money go? Where was the other $75,000 from the cashier's check I had handed directly to Trent Caldwell? I stared at those cheap white catering trucks, and a dark, icy realization began to creep into my veins. The tears completely stopped. The sorrow evaporated. My daughter had not just banned me from her wedding because she was ashamed of my rough hands. She had banned me because she did not want me inside that venue to see the truth. She did not want me to see that the grand, expensive luxury wedding I had mortgaged my house to pay for did not actually exist. Trent Caldwell was a professional wealth manager. He wore custom suits and drove expensive cars. He came from a family of supposed millions. Why would a man like that use a discount diner to cater his own high society wedding? Why would a family with that much money demand that a retired diesel mechanic pay for the entire event in liquid cash? The betrayal I felt an hour ago was nothing compared to the sickening dread that was now taking root in my stomach. This was not just a case of a snobby daughter being embarrassed by her blue-collar father. This was something much darker. This was a calculated financial deception. I looked down at the grease stains permanently embedded in my calloused hands. Trent and Preston Caldwell thought I was just a dumb, uneducated laborer. They thought I was an easy target who would just hand over his life savings and walk away quietly into the shadows. I turned the ignition key. The loud rumble of the heavy diesel engine roared to life, vibrating through the cab of the truck. I did not drive back to my empty house in defeat. I drove straight back to the main highway with a new, terrifying clarity. I was going to find out exactly where my money went. I was going to tear their pristine lives apart, piece by piece, and I was going to find the absolute truth, even if it destroyed whatever was left of my family. The absolute hardest part of betrayal is not the initial shock. The hardest part is the silence that follows. The heavy and suffocating quiet that settles into the corners of your home and refuses to leave. It had been exactly 3 days since I was turned away at the massive iron gates of the Caldwell Country Club. 3 agonizing days since Preston Caldwell handed me a piece of paper that effectively erased me from my only daughter's life. I had spent Sunday and Monday pacing the hardwood floors of my modest Charlotte home like a trapped animal. I barely ate. I barely slept. Every time I closed my exhausted eyes, I saw the cruel and mocking smirk on Preston's face. I kept replaying the stinging words of Lauren's letter in my head. A rough aesthetic, unpolished blue-collar manners, an embarrassment to her new high society network. It was Tuesday morning, and the house felt like a dark and empty museum dedicated to a family that no longer existed. I sat alone at my worn kitchen table. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long gray shadows across the linoleum floor. I was holding a ceramic mug of black coffee in my calloused hands. I was not drinking it. The dark liquid had gone completely cold over an hour ago. I just needed something solid to hold on to so my hands would stop their relentless shaking. I looked around the quiet kitchen. I looked at the height chart carved into the wooden doorframe where I had measured Lauren's growth every single year since she was a toddler. I remembered how she used to laugh and stand on her tiptoes trying to seem taller. I wondered where that sweet and innocent little girl had gone. I wondered how the child Diane and I had raised with so much love could turn into a woman who would banish her own father from the most important day of her life just to impress a family of wealthy snobs. I had tried to call her over the weekend. I must have dialed her number 30 different times. Every single call went straight to a sterile, automated voicemail. I did not leave any messages. What could I possibly say? I was completely broken. I felt a deep and hollow ache in the center of my chest that radiated out to my fingertips. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Just past 9 in the morning, the suffocating silence was violently broken. My old cell phone sitting on the kitchen table buzzed with a loud, harsh vibration against the wood. The sudden noise made my heart jump straight into my throat. I stared at the screen. The caller identification displayed Lauren's name. A massive and overwhelming wave of desperate hope washed over me. For a brief and foolish second, I truly believed she was reaching out to apologize. I convinced myself that the wedding madness had finally worn off. I thought that Trent's arrogant family had gone back to their mansions, and my daughter had finally realized the terrible mistake she had made. I thought she was texting me to say she was sorry, to tell me she loved me, and that she wished her father had been there to walk her down the aisle. I picked up the phone with trembling fingers. My thumbs were clumsy and slow as I unlocked the screen and opened the text message. I braced myself for an apology, but there was no apology. There was no remorse. There was not a single word of love or regret or sorrow. The message was incredibly long and completely transactional. It read exactly like a ransom note delivered by a cold and calculated stranger. She started the message by bragging that the wedding was a massive success and that Victoria Caldwell was finally accepting her into their elite social circle. She did not even acknowledge that I had been banned from the ceremony. She did not mention the letter. She simply moved straight to her next demand. Lauren wrote that Trent's senior colleagues at the downtown wealth management firm were all taking lavish and expensive honeymoons to places like Europe and the Maldives. She said that as an upcoming junior executive, Trent needed to project a very specific image of massive success to his clients. They had booked a 3-week luxury honeymoon to Dubai. She boasted that they were going to stay in a 5-star underwater suite and fly first class across the world. But then the tone of the message shifted into something sharp and demanding. She casually mentioned that Trent's massive performance bonus had been unexpectedly delayed at the firm due to some corporate restructuring. She claimed they needed liquid cash immediately to cover the travel agency fees and the luxury resort deposits before the reservations were canceled. Then she dropped the hammer. She told me she needed $42,000 wired directly into her new joint account by Friday afternoon. $42,000. I read the number 3 separate times because my tired mind simply could not process the sheer audacity of her words. I had just given them a cashier's check for $100,000 to pay for a luxury wedding I was not even allowed to attend. And now, just 3 days later, she was demanding another massive fortune to fund a vacation in the desert. The final paragraph of the text message completely shattered whatever was left of my heart. Lauren did not ask for the money. She explicitly threatened me for it. She wrote that if I did not wire the $42,000 by Friday, she would completely cut me out of her life forever. She stated in cold and ruthless letters that she and Trent would block my number permanently and ban me from their new townhouse. And then she delivered the ultimate crushing blow. She said that if I ruined this honeymoon and embarrassed Trent's image again, I would never be allowed to meet my future grandchildren. She promised to erase me from her family tree permanently. She said I would die a lonely old man in my cheap house with absolutely no one to care for me. I dropped the phone onto the kitchen table as if the plastic and glass had physically burned my skin. I could not breathe. My chest tightened with a physical agony that felt exactly like a massive heart attack. I stood up from the chair and stumbled backward blindly, knocking the cold mug of coffee onto the floor. The dark liquid splashed across the linoleum and shattered the mug into a dozen jagged pieces, but I did not care. I collapsed against the kitchen counter and gasped for air, clutching at my shirt. My own flesh and blood, the child I had bathed and fed and protected with my own life, was holding my future grandchildren hostage for $42,000. She was treating me like a limitless bank account. She viewed me as a disposable financial asset that could be discarded the absolute moment I stopped producing cash for her new lifestyle. The betrayal was so deep and so absolute that it completely paralyzed my logical mind. Any rational person would have seen the glaring red flags waving in the wind. Any sane man would have remembered those cheap discount diner catering trucks pulling into the country club on Saturday morning and realized he was being robbed blind. A logical mind would have asked where the first $100,000 actually went. But I was not a rational man right now. I was a broken, grieving, terrified father who was absolutely petrified of losing his only connection to this earth. I walked slowly into the living room and sat heavily on the edge of the sofa. I looked up at the wooden mantel above the fireplace. Resting in the center was the beautiful, polished urn that held Diane's ashes. I stared at the brass nameplate, and I spoke out loud to the empty room. I asked my late wife what I was supposed to do. I told her that our daughter was slipping away into a dark world of plastic smiles and ruthless greed. I cried out that I was losing our little girl. But the only answer I got back was the heavy and haunting memory of Diane's dying wish. I remembered holding Diane's frail hand in the sterile hospital room, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. I remembered the exact way she looked at me and begged me to always make our little girl happy. She had made me swear on my own soul to protect Lauren's smile at all costs. I had sworn a sacred oath to my dying wife. How could I possibly abandon Lauren now? If I said no to this demand, she would walk away from me forever. She had made that perfectly clear. I would never see her beautiful face again. I would never get to hold my grandchildren in my arms. I would spend my final declining years completely isolated and alone, sitting on my front porch until my tired heart finally gave out. The sheer terror of that total isolation completely overrode my common sense. It drowned out all of my suspicions. I made a terrible decision out of pure agonizing fear. I decided to pay the ransom. I wiped my wet face with the back of my rough hand and marched back down the hallway into my bedroom. I stripped off my comfortable faded flannel shirt and my work jeans. I opened my closet and pulled out a clean, light blue button-down shirt and my best pair of khaki slacks. I wanted to look respectable and dignified when I went down to the bank. I did not want the polished loan officers looking at me like some destitute retired mechanic begging for financial scraps. I needed them to take me seriously because I was about to pull together every single penny I had left to my name. I knew exactly what my finances looked like. I only had about $20,000 sitting in my standard life savings account. That was the absolute last of my liquid cash reserves. The rest of my financial safety net was tied up in a modest retirement pension account that I had slowly and painfully built over 40 years of repairing heavy diesel engines. It was not a massive corporate fortune, but it was supposed to keep me out of poverty when my aging body finally broke down and I could no longer work. I grabbed my leather wallet and my keys off the dresser. I walked out the front door and locked it behind me. The Carolina morning air was already growing warm and humid. I climbed into the driver's seat of my old Ford truck. The engine roared to life with its familiar, comforting, heavy rumble. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of my quiet residential driveway, heading toward the wealthy downtown commercial district where my main bank branch was located. The drive took about 25 minutes. The Charlotte traffic was heavy with morning commuters heading to their expensive corporate jobs. I watched people in sleek, imported luxury cars passing by me, completely unaware of the absolute nightmare that was unfolding inside the cab of my rusty truck. I gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I was mentally preparing my desperate speech for the bank manager. I was going to ask him to completely liquidate my retirement pension. I was fully prepared to take the massive tax penalties for early withdrawal. I was going to drain every last drop of financial security I possessed just to buy a few more years of my daughter's conditional and expensive love. I pulled into the pristine bank parking lot and found a shaded spot near the back edge of the property. I sat in the truck for a long, silent moment, with the heavy diesel engine idling. I looked down at my hands resting on the steering wheel. I stared at the dark grease stains permanently embedded deep in the creases of my skin. These hands had built a life from absolutely nothing. They had paid for braces and college tuitions and a beautiful safe home. And now these same calloused hands were going to sign away my entire future to a group of snobby elites who would not even offer me a glass of water at a dinner party. I swallowed the bitter lump of pride in my throat. I turned off the ignition. I stepped out of the truck and walked across the hot asphalt toward the large, imposing glass doors of the bank branch. The inside of the bank was bright and immaculate. The air conditioning was turned up so high it immediately raised cold goosebumps on my arms. There was a low, steady murmur of quiet professional conversations and the rapid clicking of computer keyboards. I walked straight up to the main reception desk located in the center of the lobby. The young woman sitting behind the polished marble counter greeted me with a polite and practiced corporate smile. I told her my name was Harold Jenkins, and that I needed to speak with the main branch manager immediately regarding a massive cash withdrawal from my retirement accounts. She nodded efficiently and typed my name into her glowing computer system. She asked me to take a seat in the waiting area and told me that the manager would call me into his office very shortly. I walked over and sat down heavily on a stiff leather chair in the corner of the lobby. There were a few other people waiting around me. A young, happy couple looking over colorful mortgage brochures. An older, well-dressed woman casually reading a lifestyle magazine. They all looked so normal and untroubled. I felt like an absolute alien sitting among them. I felt a heavy, nauseating knot twisting violently in my stomach. A small, quiet voice in the very back of my head was screaming at me to get up and walk out the front door. The voice of pure logic was desperately telling me that Lauren was manipulating me. It was telling me that Trent Caldwell was a fraud and a liar. It was begging me to realize that I was making a catastrophic financial mistake that would leave me homeless and broken. But the agonizing, suffocating fear of losing my only child drowned out that voice completely. I stared at the large analog clock ticking slowly on the crisp, white bank wall. Every single second felt like an eternity pressing down on my chest. I calculated the desperate numbers in my head over and over again. $20,000 from my standard savings. If I completely drained the retirement account, I might be able to pull together $25,000 more after the bank took their massive penalty fees. It would equal exactly $45,000. It would be just enough to cover the $42,000 for the Dubai honeymoon. It would be enough to satisfy Trent's ridiculous high society demands and keep my daughter in my life. I would be completely and utterly broke. I would have to find a minimum wage part-time job at 68 years old just to afford my weekly groceries. I would probably have to go back to turning heavy wrenches at a local discount auto shop just to pay my basic property taxes. But none of that mattered to me in that moment. A good father sacrifices everything for his blood. That is what I told myself. That is the desperate lie I repeated over and over again as I sat in that freezing bank lobby waiting to hand over my life to a family of thieves. I did not know yet that the sacrifice had already been taken from me without my permission. I did not know that the trap had already sprung, and that the polite bank manager sitting in his office was holding the key to a truth so devastating it would shatter my world forever. I sat in the freezing lobby of the bank, waiting for my name to be called. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady note that vibrated deep in my chest. I watched the red second hand on the large white wall clock sweep in a slow, continuous circle. Every single tick felt like a heavy stone being stacked on my tired shoulders. I was about to give away the very last pieces of my financial security to fund a luxury vacation in Dubai for people who despised me. I was doing it simply to buy my own daughter's conditional love. The bitter shame of that realization burned in the back of my throat like battery acid. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to focus on the memory of my late wife, Diane. I told myself I was honoring my deathbed promise to her. I told myself that a father's sacrifice does not ever have a limit. I tried to ignore the sick, twisting feeling in my stomach that was screaming at me to walk out the front doors and never look back. A young woman in a sharp gray suit walked out from a glass office down the hall. She smiled a polite, corporate smile and called my name. She said that David, the main branch manager, was ready to see me now. I stood up slowly. My knees ached, a dull, familiar throb from decades of kneeling on hard concrete garage floors, repairing diesel engines. I took a deep, heavy breath and followed her down a short, carpeted hallway. David was a good man. He was about my age, and we had known each other for over 20 years. He was the one who had helped Diane and me set up our very first joint savings account when we were just starting out. He was the one who shook my hand with genuine respect when I finally paid off the original mortgage on my house 5 years early. He knew how hard I worked for every single penny to my name. When I walked into his office, he stood up from his large mahogany desk and offered a warm, friendly handshake. "It is good to see you, Hal," he said, with a genuine smile. He asked me to take a seat in the comfortable leather chair across from him. He asked how the wedding went and how my beautiful daughter Lauren was doing. Those innocent questions hit me like physical blows to the stomach. I forced a stiff smile onto my face and lied through my teeth. I told him the wedding was absolutely beautiful. I told him Lauren looked like an angel and that everything went exactly as planned. I could not bring myself to tell another man that my only child had banned me from the chapel because I was an embarrassment. I could not admit that the $100,000 cashier check he had handed me a few months prior had been handed over to a family of arrogant snobs who treated me like dirt. I cleared my throat and got straight to the point. I told David that I was facing an unexpected financial emergency. I explained that I needed to pull $42,000 in liquid cash by Friday afternoon. I told him I knew my standard savings account only had about $20,000 left in it. I asked him to look into my retirement pension and see what the tax penalties would be if I completely liquidated it. I asked if there was any possible way to pull enough equity to reach the $42,000 I desperately needed. David looked at me with a deep expression of concern. He knew I was a conservative man when it came to money. He knew I would never touch my retirement pension unless it was a matter of absolute life or death. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his desk. "Hal, you know early withdrawal from that pension account will completely devastate your long-term security," he warned me softly. He told me the government penalties and the bank fees would take a massive bite out of the total. He asked me if I was absolutely sure I wanted to do this. He asked if there was any other way to handle this emergency. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I had absolutely no other choice. I told him it was for my daughter. I said I had to do it. David let out a long, heavy sigh. He nodded his head slowly and turned his attention to his computer monitor. He put on his reading glasses and began typing on his keyboard. The rapid clicking sound echoed in the quiet office. I sat there gripping the armrests of my leather chair so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I waited for him to tell me exactly how broke I was going to be for the rest of my life. But David did not give me a number. Instead, the typing completely stopped. The silence in the office became suddenly suffocating. I watched David stare at his glowing computer screen. His eyebrows furrowed together in deep confusion. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. He put the glasses back on and leaned closer to the monitor. He clicked his mouse a few times with a rapid, frantic energy. The color began to completely drain from his face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost standing right behind me. "Is everything all right, David?" I asked. My voice sounded small and tight in the quiet room. He did not answer me right away. He kept staring at the screen with his mouth slightly open. Finally, he slowly turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were wide with absolute shock and a growing sense of panic. "Hal, what exactly did you do 2 weeks ago?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper. I frowned in complete confusion. 2 weeks ago, I was busy getting my rented tuxedo tailored for the wedding. I told him I did not do anything 2 weeks ago. I asked him what he was talking about. David swallowed hard. He turned his monitor around so it was facing me. The screen was filled with rows of complex financial data and banking codes that I did not fully understand. But I did understand the large, bold numbers highlighted in red at the very top of the page. He pointed a shaking finger at the screen. He told me that I did not need to liquidate my retirement pension to find $42,000. He said I had plenty of liquid cash available in a holding account. I stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. I told him that was impossible. I said I only had my small savings and my pension. David shook his head slowly. He told me that according to the bank records, I had taken out a massive second mortgage on my house exactly 14 days ago. He said the first mortgage for $100,000 was processed months ago, just like we had planned for the wedding. But he said a second entirely separate mortgage had been executed and approved against the remaining equity of my property. The amount of the second mortgage was $250,000. The air was violently sucked out of my lungs. The entire room started to spin in slow, dizzying circles. $250,000. $250,000. That was the absolute maximum value of my entire home. That meant every single drop of equity I had spent 40 years building with my own blood and sweat was completely gone. I gripped the edge of his mahogany desk to stop myself from falling out of the chair. I told David there must be a massive clerical error. I raised my voice in sheer panic. I swore to him on my late wife's grave that I never authorized a second mortgage. I told him I had not stepped foot inside a bank since the day I picked up the original cashier check for the wedding. I demanded to know how $250,000 could be borrowed against my home without my knowledge. David immediately sprang into action. He told me to try and stay calm. He turned his monitor back around and started typing furiously. He said all mortgage documents required strict in-person verification and notarized signatures. He said he was going to pull the digital scans of the original contract right now to see exactly who processed the loan. We sat in agonizing silence while the bank servers retrieved the files. I could hear my own heart pounding, a frantic, terrifying rhythm in my ears. The dark, icy dread that had started creeping into my veins outside the country club a few days ago was now turning into a massive avalanche of pure horror. I remembered the cheap discount diner catering trucks. I remembered Lauren banning me from the chapel. I remembered Trent Caldwell smiling his arrogant corporate smile when I handed him the first envelope of cash. The printer in the corner of David's office suddenly whirred to life. It began spitting out page after page of thick legal documents. David stood up and grabbed the hot papers from the tray. He laid them flat on his desk between us. "Here is the final execution contract," he said. His voice was trembling. I leaned over the desk and stared at the paperwork. The document was a standard high-value property lien. It listed my full legal name, my home address, and my social security number perfectly. It detailed a loan of $250,000 secured against the deed of my house. The funds were directed to be deposited into a new external joint holding account. My eyes immediately dropped to the bottom of the final page, where the authorization signatures were required. I stared at the ink. The name Harold Jenkins was written on the signature line. It was my exact name. It was clearly an attempt to copy my handwriting. But I have spent 4 decades working with my hands. My fingers are stiff and calloused. My signature is always heavy, blocky, and slightly rigid. The signature on this piece of paper was smooth, fast, and fluid. It was a sloppy, hasty forgery. It looked like someone had tried to trace my name quickly before the ink could dry. "Someone forged my signature, David," I whispered. My throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. I told him I did not sign this document. I told him someone stole my identity and robbed me blind. David looked at the signature and then looked back up at me with absolute horror. He said that a forgery of this magnitude was a massive federal crime. He said the bank would have to launch a full-scale fraud investigation immediately. He pointed out that a loan of this size could not be processed remotely. It required a licensed legal notary to verify the identity of the signer under penalty of perjury. He said whoever notarized this document was the key to the entire crime. He turned the page over to the final notary section. I looked down at the paper. At the very bottom of the page, stamped in dark blue ink, was a circular official state notary seal. Inside the circle was the name of the licensed legal professional who had sworn under oath that they had verified my identity and witnessed my signature in person. The name on the stamp was Preston Caldwell, Trent's older brother, the slick local real estate attorney who had handed me the letter banning me from my own daughter's wedding. I stared at the name until the letters began to blur together. I did not scream. I did not cry out. A sudden, absolute, and terrifying silence fell over my entire mind. The frantic panic completely evaporated. The agonizing heartbreak of a rejected father instantly died in my chest. What replaced it was something much darker and much colder. I realized exactly what had happened. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together with perfect, terrifying clarity. Trent and Preston Caldwell did not just look down on me because I was a blue-collar mechanic. They saw me as an uneducated, gullible target. They saw a grieving widower who would do absolutely anything to make his daughter happy. They knew I owned my house, free and clear. Trent took my first $100,000 and used a cheap discount diner to cater the wedding so he could pocket the difference. But that was not enough for them. Preston used his legal credentials and his knowledge of the real estate market to bypass the bank verification checks. He used his official notary stamp to forge my signature on a second mortgage. They stole $250,000 right out from under my feet. And Lauren, my beautiful, smart daughter, she had demanded $42,000 for a luxury honeymoon in Dubai. She had threatened to cut me out of my life if I did not wire her the cash. She was treating me like a limitless bank account because she thought I was too stupid to realize I was being drained. She banned me from the wedding so I would not see the cheap food and ask questions. I was completely bankrupt. I was holding a massive amount of fraudulent debt. If I did not pay this mortgage, the bank would foreclose on my house. They would seize the property Diane and I had built together. I would be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing. The Caldwell family was going to leave me completely homeless while they flew first class to the other side of the world. David reached across the desk and gently touched my arm. He looked terrified. "Hal," he said quietly, "we need to call the police right now. We need to get the federal authorities involved. This is a massive conspiracy. They stole your entire life." I slowly pulled my arm away from his hand. I stood up from the leather chair. I looked down at my hands. The heavy, dark grease stains were still visible in the deep creases of my skin. These hands had built engines that hauled thousands of tons of steel across the country. These hands knew how to take a broken, massive machine apart piece by piece and put it back together. I looked at David with an icy calm expression. I told him not to call the police yet. David looked at me like I was insane. He told me Preston Caldwell was a licensed attorney and Trent handled millions of dollars. He said if I confronted them without the authorities, they would use their high-priced lawyers to crush me. He said they would destroy the evidence and claim I was just a confused old man trying to back out of a loan. I told David I knew exactly how powerful they were. I told him I knew I was just a retired mechanic with dirty hands. But I also knew that calling the police right now would just tip them off. They would lawyer up and hide the money. I needed absolute concrete proof that they planned this together. I needed to trap them in a corner where all their wealth and all their snobby connections could not save them. I asked David to print me a certified copy of the forged mortgage documents. I asked him to seal it in a bank envelope and hand it directly to me. I told him to freeze the loan processing on his end silently, under the guise of a routine security audit so they could not access the funds yet. David hesitated for a long moment, but he saw the absolute unwavering resolve burning in my eyes. He nodded slowly. He printed the copies, stamped them with his official branch manager seal, and handed me the envelope. I walked out of that bank a completely different man than the one who had walked in. I was no longer a grieving, desperate father trying to buy his daughter's affection. I was a man who had just watched his entire life's work get stolen by a family of arrogant thieves. They thought because I wore faded flannel and scrubbed grease out of my fingernails that I was weak. They thought I would just lay down and let them take my home. They were wrong. I climbed into the driver's seat of my old Ford truck. I placed the envelope of forged documents on the passenger seat right next to Diane's photograph. I started the heavy diesel engine and listened to it roar to life. I was going to tear their pristine lives apart piece by piece. I was going to find the absolute truth and build a cage so strong they would never escape. The Caldwell family had just started a war with a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I drove away from the bank with a cold and heavy silence settling completely over my mind. The frantic and suffocating panic that had gripped my chest just an hour ago had completely evaporated. The agonizing heartbreak of a rejected and humiliated father died right there in the driver's seat of my old truck. What replaced it was a sharp and icy clarity that felt as heavy as a solid iron anvil. I knew exactly what Trent Caldwell and his slick brother Preston had done to me. They had stolen $250,000 from the equity of my home. They had forged my signature on official legal documents. And worst of all, they had used my own daughter to try and bleed my last remaining retirement funds dry to pay for a luxury vacation. Most men my age would have driven straight to the local police station. Most men would have walked into the precinct lobby waving the forged papers and begging a detective to help them. But I knew better. I had lived a long and hard life, and I knew that men like the Caldwell family lived by a completely different set of rules. They had expensive corporate lawyers. They had deep connections in the local government. If I went to the authorities with just a printed copy of a forged document, Preston would simply use his legal credentials to claim I had signed it in his presence and suddenly forgot due to my old age. They would easily tie me up in endless and expensive court battles until the bank foreclosed on my house and I died of a broken heart. I did not need the police right now. I needed absolute and undeniable proof. I needed to build a concrete cage so flawlessly constructed that all their generational wealth and all their snobby social connections could not save them from federal prison. I knew exactly where Trent and Lauren were that morning. They were attending a lavish post-wedding brunch at the country club with Victoria Caldwell. They would be gone for hours drinking expensive imported champagne and laughing at how easily they had manipulated the old grease-stained mechanic. That arrogant celebration gave me a wide-open window to make my first move. But before I drove to their new upscale townhouse, I needed the right tools for the job. I did not go to a hardware store. I drove my rusty truck to a specialized electronics shop located on the edge of the downtown commercial district. I walked inside wearing my faded work clothes and paid cash for 3 high-grade voice-activated micro recorders. They were incredibly small devices, no bigger than a thick, heavy winter coat button, and they were specifically designed to pick up faint whispers from across a large open room. I bought extra lithium batteries and a thick roll of heavy-duty double-sided mounting tape. I was going to turn their beautiful new home into a permanent trap. I drove toward the wealthy suburban neighborhood where Trent and Lauren had recently moved. As I navigated the wide and winding residential streets, I looked at the pristine, manicured lawns and the expensive imported luxury vehicles parked in the driveways. I felt a sick and violent twisting feeling in my gut. I knew deep down that the $250,000 they had stolen from the equity of my home had been used to buy their way into this exclusive zip code. They were sleeping under a massive roof, paid for by my 40 years of breathing toxic diesel exhaust. I parked my old truck 3 blocks away on a busy public street, so it would not draw any unwanted attention from the private neighborhood security patrols. I walked the rest of the way entirely on foot. The Carolina morning sun was beating down, making the back of my neck sweat against my collar, but my mind remained completely cold and focused. I approached their massive townhouse from the rear service alley. It was a beautiful 3-story brick building with a large attached 2-car garage. I knew Trent was arrogant and careless. Men who willingly steal from their own family members always believe they are untouchable ghosts. I walked right up to the side door of the garage. It was secured by a modern electronic keypad lock with a glowing blue light. Trent probably thought that expensive piece of plastic made his home completely impenetrable. But I have spent my entire adult life working intimately with complex and heavy machinery. I know exactly how electrical circuits and mechanical latches operate in the real world. A lock is just a simple machine, and every single machine has a physical bypass if you know exactly where to apply the right amount of leverage. I reached into my front pocket and pulled out a thin piece of rigid tension wire I had cut from a heavy steel coat hanger earlier that morning. I slid the wire carefully through the thick rubber weather stripping at the very top of the garage door frame. I fished around blindly in the dark gap for a few seconds, until I felt the emergency release cord dangling from the overhead mechanical track. I hooked the wire securely around the small plastic handle and gave it a sharp and steady downward pull. The heavy metal locking mechanism clicked open with a loud and satisfying metallic snap. I pushed the heavy garage door up just enough to slide my body underneath. I was officially inside the fortress. The air in the garage was cool and smelled of fresh, expensive paint and premium car wax. I stood up and dusted the concrete dust off the knees of my jeans. I walked over and tried the interior wooden door leading directly into the main house. It was completely unlocked. Absolute arrogance is always a criminal's biggest weakness. I turned the brass knob and stepped into the pristine hallway of my daughter's stolen home. The house was absolutely immaculate. It looked like a flawless photograph ripped straight out of a luxury design magazine. The expansive floors were covered in thick white, pristine carpets. The furniture was sleek, modern, and clearly imported. There were heavy crystal vases and massive abstract paintings hanging on the freshly painted walls. I walked through the massive living room, moving silently like a ghost. I deliberately did not touch anything that I did not absolutely need to touch. I was a man on a very specific mission, and I had absolutely no time to mourn the beautiful daughter who had chosen this plastic, superficial wealth over my genuine and unconditional love. I made my way up the floating hardwood staircase toward the 2nd floor. I was looking for one specific room. I walked down the wide carpeted hallway and immediately found Trent's home office. The double doors were wide open. I stepped inside and took a long look around. It was a massive room with a heavy, dark mahogany desk sitting right in the center. There was a genuine leather executive chair and a towering wall of custom-built bookshelves displaying heavy corporate finance volumes and fake awards. It looked exactly like the office of a highly successful and wealthy junior executive. But as I walked closer to the center of the room, the grand illusion of their perfect wealthy life began to crumble into dust. The top of the beautiful mahogany desk was completely cluttered with disorganized and chaotic stacks of paper. I carefully leaned over the desk and began reading the documents without moving a single page out of place. They were not impressive investment portfolios or confidential client files. They were desperate past due notices. There were incredibly aggressive warning letters from high-interest credit card companies demanding immediate minimum payments to avoid legal action. There were bright red final notices from luxury car leasing agencies threatening to repossess their vehicles by the end of the month. There were massive unpaid tax bills scattered everywhere. Trent Caldwell was not a successful junior wealth manager. He was completely and utterly bankrupt. He was drowning in a massive ocean of toxic debt. The realization washed over me with a sickening and terrifying clarity. The $100,000 cashier check I had given him to pay for the luxury wedding caterers had likely gone straight into the pockets of his angry creditors and bookies. He had used the discount diner trucks because he had already spent my cash to save his own skin. But that initial $100,000 had not been nearly enough to save him from total ruin. That is exactly why they needed to steal the extra $250,000 through the forged second mortgage. They were bleeding me dry just to keep their fake high society image alive for a few more months. I slowly pulled open the top right drawer of the heavy mahogany desk. I was looking for anything that connected him directly to the bank fraud. I pushed aside a messy pile of expensive silver pens and a thick stack of blank corporate business cards. And then my eyes locked onto it. Sitting carelessly in the very back corner of the wooden drawer was a heavy metal object. I reached out with a steady hand and picked it up. It was an official state notary stamp. I turned the heavy metal contraption over and looked closely at the engraved rubber lettering on the bottom plate. The name printed in reverse block letters was Preston Caldwell. My heart slammed against my ribs with a heavy and violent thud. This was the exact stamp that had been used to forge the official verification on my stolen home equity documents. Preston had used his legal credentials to rob me, and then he had left his official stamp sitting in his younger brother's desk drawer like it was a meaningless plastic toy. They were so incredibly confident that I was just a dumb, uneducated, and trusting old mechanic that they did not even bother to hide the murder weapon. I held the heavy metal stamp in my calloused palm. Every ounce of my being wanted to put it in my pocket, drive straight to the federal authorities, and slam it down on a detective's desk. But I knew the rigid rules of legal evidence. If I stole the stamp from this house, their expensive lawyers would simply claim I had planted it to frame them in a desperate custody dispute over the money. The stamp had to stay exactly where it was. It was a beautiful piece of bait, and I was going to leave it right there on the hook. I carefully placed the notary stamp back into the dark corner of the drawer, exactly how I had found it. I gently pushed the mahogany wood panel closed, making absolutely sure it did not make a single squeaking sound. I had found the concrete physical proof I needed to justify my upcoming actions. Now I needed to capture their own arrogant voices confessing to the crime on tape. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the 3 voice-activated micro-recorders I had purchased earlier that morning. I peeled the protective paper backing off a small square of the heavy-duty double-sided mounting tape and pressed it firmly against the back of the first black recording device. I got down on my knees and crawled entirely under Trent's massive mahogany desk. I reached my arm up high into the dark, hollow space directly behind the center drawer, where no one would ever look unless they were completely dismantling the furniture with power tools. I pressed the sticky side of the recorder hard against the raw, unfinished wood. I held it there for 10 long seconds, until I was absolutely certain it was securely attached to the frame. I flipped the tiny power switch with my thumbnail. A microscopic red light blinked once in the darkness and then went completely black. The first trap was officially set and waiting. I crawled out from under the desk and carefully brushed the white carpet fibers off the knees of my faded jeans. I left the home office and walked quietly back down the floating hardwood staircase to the main floor. I needed to plant the remaining 2 recording devices in the areas where they were most likely to have casual and unprotected conversations about their stolen money. I walked into the pristine modern kitchen. There was a massive imported marble island in the exact center of the room, with tall, expensive leather bar stools. This was exactly the kind of open space where arrogant people stood around drinking expensive wine and boasting about their clever and successful schemes. I bent down and reached far under the deep overhang of the heavy marble counter. I pressed the second micro-recorder firmly against the hidden wooden support beam. I flipped the power switch and waited for the invisible red light to confirm it was actively listening. The final recorder was the most important one. I walked into the massive sunken living room. In the exact center of the vast space was a huge custom-made velvet sofa facing a massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. I walked around to the very back of the sofa. It was pushed just a few inches away from the pristine white wall. I knelt down and reached my calloused hand deep into the dark and dusty gap between the heavy velvet fabric and the wooden baseboard. I stuck the third and final recording device directly to the cold metal frame of the sofa, completely out of sight from any angle. I flipped the switch and felt a grim satisfaction as it activated. I stood up and took one final meticulous look around the beautiful and silent townhouse. I had left absolutely no physical trace of my presence behind. The carpets were unruffled and smooth. The doors were perfectly aligned. Everything was exactly as I had found it when I broke in. I walked back out through the modern kitchen and into the cool, sheltered air of the garage. I slipped carefully under the partially opened garage door and pulled it firmly down behind me until the heavy mechanical latch clicked securely and permanently back into place. I walked down the sunlit residential street toward my old, rusty truck. The heavy and suffocating sorrow that had been crushing my chest for the past few days was completely gone. The tears were a thing of the past. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the roaring diesel engine. I was no longer a grieving and pathetic father weeping in a dirt parking lot over a lost daughter. I was a mechanic who had just silently wired a highly explosive trap under the very foundation of a corrupt and arrogant empire. All I had to do now was sit back in the shadows, put on my headphones, and wait for them to strike the match. I sat in the cab of my old Ford truck for 2 entire days. I parked 3 blocks away from their pristine townhouse in a shaded visitor spot that did not require a resident permit. I kept the windows cracked just a fraction of an inch to let the warm Carolina air circulate, but I never turned on the engine. I did not want the familiar heavy rumble of the diesel motor to draw any unwanted attention from the private neighborhood security patrols. I lived on black coffee poured from a battered silver thermos and stale protein bars I kept stashed in the glove compartment. The interior of the truck smelled like old vinyl and dried sweat and the sharp metallic tang of diesel fuel. My lower back ached constantly from sleeping sitting upright in the worn driver's seat. The steering wheel dug into my ribs every time I shifted my weight, but I completely ignored the physical pain. A father who is fighting for his very survival, and the absolute truth does not care about a stiff neck or a hungry stomach. I had my thick, heavy-duty work headphones plugged directly into the receiver, resting on the dashboard. The digital receiver was linked wirelessly to the 3 voice-activated micro-recorders I had planted inside their home. For the first 24 hours, the audio feeds were mostly agonizingly quiet. I heard the muffled sounds of heavy doors opening and closing. I heard the distant hum of their expensive television playing some mindless reality show in the background. I heard Trent occasionally yelling at a customer service representative over the phone about a declined luxury credit card. Every single time the red light on my receiver blinked, indicating that a voice had activated the recording, my heart would slam violently against my ribs. I would hold my breath waiting for the confession. But it was just fragments. It was just the meaningless daily noise of people who thought they were completely alone and secure in their fortress of stolen wealth. I waited with the absolute patience of a man who has spent 40 years waiting for thick, molten metal to cool and harden. I knew that eventually the rats would gather in the same room to discuss their stolen cheese. Criminals cannot resist the urge to gloat about their supposed brilliance. That moment finally arrived on late Thursday evening. The sun had already dipped below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the quiet suburban street. The automatic streetlights flickered on, bathing the expensive neighborhood in a dull yellow glow. Inside the dark cab of my truck, the receiver suddenly lit up with a solid, bright red light. I pressed the heavy headphones tight against my ears, blocking out the sounds of the outside world. I heard the heavy wooden front door of the townhouse open and close with a solid thud. I heard the distinct, rapid clicking of expensive high heels walking across the pristine hardwood floors. It was Victoria Caldwell. She had arrived for a private family visit. The audio feed from the hidden microphone I had stuck behind the velvet living room sofa was crystal clear. I could hear the sharp, pleasant clinking of crystal glasses being set down on the glass coffee table. I heard the festive pop of a cork and the sound of bubbling liquid being poured. They were drinking champagne. They were celebrating their grand victory while I was sitting in a sweltering truck with $250,000 of fraudulent debt permanently chained to my name. I heard Trent let out a long, heavy sigh. He sounded physically exhausted, but deeply relieved. He told his mother that the final wire transfer had officially cleared the international holding accounts just an hour ago. Victoria let out a soft, sophisticated laugh. She told her son that she was incredibly proud of him for handling the immense pressure so remarkably well. She confidently stated that Preston had done a flawless job utilizing his legal credentials to bypass the notary verifications at the bank without raising a single red flag. Then the conversation shifted abruptly, and the first massive layer of their intricate deception was violently stripped away. Victoria asked Trent if his former partners at the downtown wealth management firm had contacted the federal authorities yet. My blood ran completely cold in my veins. Former partners. Trent laughed a bitter, arrogant sound that echoed through the wire. He confidently stated that the firm was far too terrified of a massive public relations nightmare to press any formal criminal charges. He casually admitted to his mother and brother that he had been officially fired over 6 months ago. He had not managed a single dime of legitimate client money since the previous autumn. He had been quietly terminated because the senior partners discovered he was actively embezzling massive funds from the retirement accounts of elderly clients to cover his catastrophic personal gambling debts. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my truck so hard my calloused hands began to cramp. Trent Caldwell was not a highly successful junior executive. He was a disgraced, unemployed criminal drowning in toxic debt. Preston spoke up next. His slick, professional attorney voice echoed clearly through the hidden microphone. He told Trent that the aggressive bookies were officially off his back for good. Preston confirmed that the $100,000 cashier check I had handed over for the luxury wedding caterers had been successfully laundered through a series of complex shell accounts. The money had gone directly to an underground gambling syndicate to pay off Trent's massive sports betting losses before they broke his legs. Preston actually laughed out loud and said that using a cheap discount diner to cater the high society wedding was a stroke of absolute genius. He gloated that nobody at the exclusive country club dared to complain about the greasy food to the wealthy Caldwell family. They all just assumed it was some kind of trendy, rustic aesthetic choice by the bride. My chest burned with a suffocating, agonizing fury. The entire wedding was a complete theatrical sham. My beautiful daughter walked down the grand aisle at an event completely funded by a desperate criminal trying to save his own kneecaps from violent men. I had secretly mortgaged the equity of my fully paid-off home just to feed a degenerate gambler. But the absolute worst was yet to come. The $100,000 was just the appetizer for their greed. The forged second mortgage was the main course. Victoria asked about the strict timeline for their immediate departure. She wanted to know exactly when her boys and her new daughter-in-law were officially leaving the country. Trent confidently replied that the plane tickets were booked and confirmed for the following Monday morning. First class, direct to Dubai. I listened in absolute horrified silence as Preston laid out the exact legal mechanics of their escape plan. He explained in cold, calculating terms that the United Arab Emirates did not have a standard extradition treaty with the United States for the specific types of complex, white-collar financial fraud they were actively committing. He said that once Trent and Lauren landed on the ground in Dubai, they would be completely untouchable by the federal authorities here in America. The $250,000 they had stolen from the second mortgage on my house was completely untraceable now. It had been meticulously routed through offshore accounts controlled entirely by Victoria and deposited into a secure private bank in Dubai, waiting to indefinitely fund their lavish new expatriate lifestyle. They were not just going on a 3-week luxury honeymoon to impress Trent's fake colleagues. They were fleeing the country permanently. They were taking my life savings and running to the other side of the world to escape the severe legal consequences of their massive financial crimes. Then I heard a voice that made my heart completely stop beating in my chest. It was Lauren. My only daughter walked casually into the living room. I heard the delicate sound of her pouring herself a fresh glass of champagne. She cheerfully asked Trent if the luxury travel agency had finally confirmed the reservation for the massive underwater suite at the resort. Trent kissed her. I heard the sickening sound of their affection transmitted over the wire. He told her everything was absolutely perfect and ready to go. Victoria spoke to Lauren next. Her tone was dripping with elite condescension, but also a sick, twisted sense of criminal camaraderie. She asked my daughter if she was absolutely sure she was ready to leave her old, pathetic life completely behind. Lauren did not hesitate for a single solitary second. Her voice was light, airy, and completely devoid of any human remorse. She laughed and said there was absolutely nothing left for her in Charlotte anymore anyway. Then Trent asked the specific question that finally snapped the absolute last remaining tether of my parental blindness. He asked Lauren what was going to happen to her father when the bank finally realized the massive second mortgage was not being paid. I stopped breathing. I sat frozen in the sweltering cab waiting for my daughter to defend me. I waited for the little girl I had raised completely alone to show a single shred of humanity or basic guilt. I prayed to God that she did not know the full devastating extent of their criminal plan. I wanted desperately to believe that Trent was manipulating her mind just like he manipulated my wallet. Lauren took a slow sip of champagne. I heard the expensive crystal glass clink softly against her teeth. She sighed dramatically and said that I would just have to figure it out on my own like I always did. She told Trent that I was a tough old mechanic who was totally used to living in poverty anyway. She casually stated that when the bank finally foreclosed on my house, I could just move into a cheap retirement trailer park on the edge of town or find a small government-subsidized apartment. She actually giggled and said that being suddenly homeless might finally force me to sell that ugly, rusty old truck I stubbornly insisted on driving everywhere. Preston chuckled warmly. He coldly added that the bank would move swiftly and aggressively once the very first massive payment bounced. He said the legal foreclosure process would be absolutely brutal, and that a man my advanced age would never be able to financially recover from that kind of massive credit destruction. He joked maliciously that I would be working minimum wage as a greeter at a local hardware store until the day I dropped dead. Victoria agreed enthusiastically. She told Lauren that she was doing the absolutely right thing by cutting dead, useless weight from her life. She praised my daughter for finally stepping up and becoming a true ruthless member of the elite Caldwell family. The audio feed continued playing, but I could no longer hear their arrogant voices. The sound of their cruel, mocking laughter faded into a loud, piercing, ringing noise, echoing endlessly inside my skull. I reached up with trembling hands and slowly pulled the heavy headphones off my ears. I set them gently on the cracked vinyl passenger seat right next to the framed photograph of my late wife, Diane. I sat in the dark, silent cab of my truck and stared blindly through the dirty windshield at the quiet, idyllic suburban street. I did not shed a single tear. When you suddenly realize that your entire life was a massive lie, and when you discover that your own flesh and blood has actively conspired to financially destroy you for a paycheck, the tears simply do not come. The deep sorrow is instantly burned away by a righteous fire so hot and so absolute that it leaves nothing but pure solid iron resolve behind. Lauren knew everything. She knew about the forged mortgage documents. She knew about the stolen home equity. She knew that I was going to be violently thrown out of the house where I had raised her, where her mother had died, where I had spent 40 long years of my life paying off the bank with blood and sweat. She knew all of it, and she was actively drinking imported champagne to celebrate my absolute ruin. She had sent me that cruel, demanding text message asking for $42,000 for the honeymoon as a deliberate tactical distraction. It was a calculated psychological manipulation strictly designed to keep me panicked and completely focused on my remaining meager savings so I would not look closely at the deed to my house. They were playing me like a desperate broken fiddle while they packed their designer bags to flee to Dubai. I looked down at my hands in the dim light. The thick, heavy calluses and the permanent dark grease stains trapped deep under the creases of my skin. These hands had built massive engines. These hands had repaired broken machines that weighed thousands of tons. These hands had worked agonizing double shifts through severe physical pain to buy Lauren her first bicycle, to pay for her college tuition, to buy her the beautiful white dress she wore when she brutally betrayed me. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be a good, reliable father. I had strictly honored my sacred deathbed promise to Diane. I had blindly sacrificed my pride, my dignity, and my ultimate financial security just to protect my daughter's smile. But the cold, heartless woman sitting in that luxury townhouse laughing about my upcoming homelessness was not my daughter anymore. She was a Caldwell now. She had consciously chosen her side. She had willingly traded the genuine, unconditional love of a hard-working father for the plastic criminal wealth of a family of sociopath. The agonizing, suffocating heartbreak that had been violently crushing my chest for the past week was completely gone forever. The desperate, pathetic need to win back my child's affection had evaporated entirely into the humid Carolina night air. I reached forward and turned the heavy brass key in the ignition. The massive diesel engine roared to life with a loud, violent rumble, shaking the entire metal frame of the old truck. I put the heavy vehicle in gear and slowly pulled away from the curb, leaving the pristine, affluent neighborhood completely behind in the darkness. I was no longer a grieving, heartbroken father weeping over a lost relationship. I was a veteran mechanic who had just been handed the exact structural blueprints to a massive, complex, and incredibly dangerous machine. I knew exactly how their elaborate criminal enterprise was wired together. I knew precisely where the fatal structural weaknesses were hidden. I knew exactly where to apply the maximum amount of leverage to make their entire corrupt system catastrophically and publicly fail. They thought they were dealing with a stupid, uneducated, blue-collar laborer who would just lay down and quietly accept his tragic fate. They thought they were completely untouchable ghosts because they wore custom Italian suits and drank expensive vintage champagne and used slick legal jargon to hide their blatant theft. But a hard-working man who has absolutely nothing left to lose is the most dangerous machine on earth. I drove through the empty, quiet city streets toward my dark, empty house. I was going to let them pack their expensive bags. I was going to let them buy their luxurious first-class tickets. I was going to let them show up to their lavish country club farewell party on Friday night fully believing they had won the ultimate prize. And then I was going to violently tear their entire fake, pristine world apart piece by piece. And I was absolutely not going to stop until every single one of them was permanently locked in a federal steel cage. A mechanic knows that discovering the broken part is only the very first step of the job. You cannot dismantle a massive corrupt machine with your bare hands. You need the absolute right heavy-duty tools. I knew that Trent and Preston Caldwell came from a world of expensive tailored suits, luxury cars, and high-end corporate connections. If I walked into a standard local police precinct with my wild story and a printed copy of a forged document, their slick defense lawyers would tie me up in endless procedural red tape. They would delay the investigation for months until the bank officially foreclosed on my house and I was living on the street. I did not need a sympathetic family lawyer who wanted to talk about mediation and feelings. I needed a legal predator. I needed someone who despised arrogant white-collar thieves just as much as I did. I found that exact person in a stark and uninviting office building located in the center of the downtown financial district. Her name was Rebecca Cross. She was a former federal prosecutor who had built an absolutely terrifying and ruthless reputation in the private sector for tearing apart organized real estate fraud rings. When I walked into her sterile glass office wearing my faded work jeans and my heavy boots, she did not offer me a cup of coffee. She did not offer me a sympathetic and pitying smile. She simply looked at my heavy, grease-stained hands pointed to the leather chair across from her massive desk and asked me exactly who I wanted to put in a federal steel cage. I sat down and emptied my canvas work bag onto her pristine desk. I handed over the certified copies of the forged second mortgage that I had secured from my bank manager. I handed her the digital receiver containing the crystal-clear audio recordings I had secretly captured from the hidden microphones inside Trent's luxurious townhouse. I sat in total silence for nearly 2 hours, while Rebecca read every single page of the documents and listened to the arrogant voices of the Caldwell family boasting about their elaborate theft. I watched her sharp eyes narrow. A cold and incredibly dangerous smile slowly crept across her face. She leaned back in her chair and told me that Preston Caldwell was an absolute fool. She explained that using his official state notary stamp to bypass the standard bank verification checks was a massive and fatal mistake. She said arrogant men always leave a sloppy trail because they firmly believe the working-class people they are robbing are too stupid to ever fight back. But Rebecca stated very clearly that we needed absolute financial certainty before we sprang the final trap. We could not just accuse them of fraud. We needed to map the exact route of every single stolen penny so they could not hide a single dime offshore when the authorities finally moved in. She picked up her phone and made a single phone call. Less than an hour later, a man named Thomas walked into the office. Thomas was a veteran forensic accountant who specialized in tracing laundered money through complex international criminal networks. He was quiet, meticulously dressed, and possessed a mind that worked exactly like a high-powered tracking computer. For the next 48 hours, I essentially lived in the corner of Rebecca's conference room. I sat in a leather chair drinking bitter black coffee, while she and Thomas completely dismantled the Caldwell family's fake financial empire piece by piece. Thomas set up 3 large computer monitors on the conference table. He tapped into a massive database of property records, banking routing numbers, and corporate shell companies. He began to manually trace the $250,000 that had been fraudulently sucked out of my home equity. It did not take him long to find the massive, rotting core of their criminal enterprise. The stolen money had not just been deposited into Trent's standard checking account. Thomas discovered that the funds had been rapidly wired through a complex series of blind corporate trusts within 24 hours of the loan being approved. It was a sophisticated digital maze designed to confuse standard banking auditors. But forensic accountants know exactly how to follow the digital fingerprints. Thomas cracked the final layer of the corporate shell structure late on Thursday evening. He found the ultimate destination of my stolen life savings. The money was resting in a secure offshore holding account located in the Cayman Islands. Thomas pulled up the official registration documents for the holding company and displayed them on the large screen in the center of the room. The sole managing director listed on that hidden offshore account was Victoria Caldwell. The conspiracy was much larger and much darker than I had originally thought. The entire Caldwell family was completely complicit. It was not just Trent making a desperate move to cover his massive illegal gambling debts. It was a fully coordinated and meticulously planned family operation to bleed a working-class father entirely dry. Victoria was actively using her elite social status and her offshore financial connections to hide the money her sons stole. Preston was using his legal credentials to facilitate the real estate fraud and forge the official verification signatures without triggering alarms. They had planned to drain my home equity completely dry. They were going to transfer the liquid cash to an untouchable international account and then flee to their luxury resort in Dubai, where there was no extradition treaty to hold them accountable. They were going to leave me completely bankrupt, humiliated and broken on the streets of Charlotte, while they drank premium imported champagne on the other side of the world. Rebecca looked at me across the conference table with a look of grim and absolute satisfaction. She said we finally had enough concrete financial evidence to have the federal authorities kick their heavy wooden doors down by midnight. We had the clear financial motive. We had the forged legal documents. We had the audio recordings of their conspiracy. And we had the exact location of the stolen international funds. The iron cage was completely welded shut, and the Caldwell family was trapped inside. But then Thomas sighed heavily and slid one final piece of paper across the polished wooden table toward me. He said he had found one more authorized wire transfer form while he was digging through the final layer of the bank records. This specific document was the direct authorization to pay the international travel agency for the lavish 3-week Dubai honeymoon. The massive payment of $42,000 was pulled directly from the fraudulent holding account containing my stolen home equity. I looked down at the printed sheet of paper. My heart, which had been beating with a cold and steady rhythm of righteous justice, suddenly stopped dead in my chest. I stared at the bottom of the authorization form. The signature on the authorization line did not belong to Trent. It did not belong to Preston. It did not belong to Victoria. The signature authorizing the theft of my money for a luxury vacation belonged entirely to my daughter. It was Lauren's signature. I knew her handwriting perfectly. I had spent decades reading that exact same elegant, sweeping script on handmade Father's Day cards, on high school permission slips, and on college applications. It was perfectly clear and legally binding. She had actively signed the document to spend the money they stole from my house. I stared at the ink until my vision blurred. I desperately wanted to believe it was just another clever forgery. I wanted to believe that Preston had copied her name just like he had maliciously copied mine. I looked up at Rebecca and Thomas, with a silent, pleading desperation burning in my eyes. I asked them to tell me it was a fake. I begged them to tell me my little girl was innocent. But Rebecca did not offer me any false comfort. She gently reached across the table and pressed a button on the digital audio receiver. She told me she had been reviewing the most recent audio files captured from the living room of the townhouse just a few hours prior. She said she was incredibly sorry, but I needed to hear the absolute truth for myself, so I would know exactly who I was fighting. I put the heavy headphones over my ears. The sterile walls of the law office completely faded away. I heard the familiar sharp clinking of expensive crystal glasses. I heard the soft hum of the air conditioning inside their stolen home. And then I heard my daughter's voice. Lauren was not crying. She was not expressing any guilt or fear about the massive financial crime her husband was committing against her own father. She was laughing. It was a bright, airy, and incredibly cruel sound that sent jagged shards of solid ice straight through my veins. She was having a casual conversation with Victoria Caldwell. I listened in absolute horrified silence as Lauren proudly boasted to her mother-in-law about how incredibly easy it had been to manipulate me. She laughed out loud about the desperate and pathetic text message she had sent me demanding $42,000 for the honeymoon. She actually bragged about using the emotional threat of future grandchildren to keep me completely panicked and distracted, so I would not check my credit report while the bank processed the fraudulent second mortgage. Victoria chuckled warmly on the recording. She praised Lauren for being so remarkably ruthless and stepping up to protect the Caldwell family interests. Victoria casually asked if I had suspected anything when I handed over the original $100,000 cashier check for the fake luxury caterers. Lauren laughed even harder. Her voice dripped with absolute elite condescension. She told Victoria that her father was just a clueless, uneducated old mechanic who was so desperate for her love that he would blindly sign away his own life if she asked him to. She called me a pathetic and lonely old man who was stuck in the past. Then she delivered the final crushing blow. She explicitly stated that she could not wait to leave the country and never have to look at my dirty, grease-stained hands ever again. She joked that I would probably end up living in my rusty old Ford truck by the end of the year. She said the moment their first-class airplane took off for Dubai, I would cease to exist in her world completely. I sat frozen in the leather chair as the audio recording clicked off and dissolved into static. I slowly pulled the heavy headphones off my ears. I placed them gently on the glass desk, perfectly aligned with the edges of the table. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream. I did not pound my fists against the table in a blind rage. The agonizing and suffocating heartbreak that had been violently crushing my chest for the past week completely vanished. The desperate, pathetic need to protect my little girl evaporated entirely into the cold air of the room. When a man finally realizes that the child he sacrificed his entire life to protect is actually a monster who views him as a disposable bank account, something fundamental breaks inside his soul. But it does not break into weak and fragile pieces. It breaks into pure, solid, unyielding iron. The final tether of my paternal blindness violently snapped. I realized in that exact moment that Lauren was not a poor victim being manipulated by Trent. She was not a confused young woman trapped in a toxic marriage. She was an active, willing, and incredibly enthusiastic participant in my absolute destruction. She had signed the wire transfers. She had drafted the emotional ransom notes. She had actively conspired with a family of thieves to leave me completely homeless on the streets just to fund her plastic high society lifestyle. I looked up at Rebecca Cross. My hands were no longer shaking. My posture was perfectly straight. My voice was low, steady, and cold as a winter grave. I told the lawyer that I did not care that Lauren was my own flesh and blood anymore. I told her that blood does not excuse betrayal of this magnitude. I told her I wanted every single person involved in that townhouse completely and utterly destroyed. I told her to prepare the final strike and call the federal authorities because I was going to crash their lavish country club farewell party on Friday night, and I was going to burn their entire fake empire straight to the ground. A man who has spent 40 years diagnosing heavy diesel machinery knows a fundamental truth about catastrophic failures. Sometimes you have to deliberately let a broken engine run just a little bit longer under maximum pressure so you can expose the exact location of the fatal crack. You have to feed it fuel. You have to let it roar and vibrate until it finally tears itself completely apart from the inside out. I had all the concrete evidence I needed to destroy the Caldwell family. I had the forged mortgage documents. I had the offshore bank routing numbers. I had their arrogant voices recorded on hidden microphones, plotting to leave me entirely homeless. But if I just handed that evidence over to a random local detective on a Tuesday afternoon, Trent and Preston would immediately use their expensive corporate lawyers to quietly negotiate a plea deal behind closed doors. They would hide their stolen assets in a web of legal red tape. I did not want a quiet plea deal. I wanted a public and absolute execution of justice. I wanted to tear their pristine high society facade completely to the ground in front of every single snobby elitist they were desperately trying to impress. To do that, I needed to play the absolute hardest role of my entire life. I needed to pretend that I was still a blind, desperate, and pathetic old fool who was willing to buy his daughter's love at any cost. I sat at my worn kitchen table on Wednesday morning holding my cheap cell phone in my calloused hands. The screen was glowing in the dim light of the early dawn. I opened the text message thread with Lauren. The last message from her was the cruel and demanding ransom note where she threatened to cut me out of her life permanently if I did not wire her $42,000 for her luxury honeymoon in Dubai. I stared at her name at the top of the screen. I forced down the bitter bile rising in my throat and began to type. I meticulously crafted a message designed to feed her massive ego. I wrote that I was incredibly sorry for causing any problems with the wedding. I told her that I had gone down to the bank and completely drained the very last of my retirement pension. I lied and said I had the $42,000 secured in a certified cashier check. But I added one specific and non-negotiable condition. I wrote that I wanted to hand the physical check directly to her and Trent in person, to wish them well. I asked if I could briefly stop by their lavish Bon Voyage farewell party at the country club on Friday night to deliver the envelope and say goodbye before they flew across the world. I pressed send. I placed the phone flat on the wooden table and waited. I did not have to wait blindly. I immediately grabbed the digital audio receiver connected to the hidden microphones I had planted inside their upscale townhouse. I plugged in my heavy-duty work headphones and pressed them tightly against my ears. I sat in the absolute silence of my empty kitchen and listened to the live feed of my daughter's stolen life. The audio was crystal clear. I could hear the faint hum of their central air conditioning and the rhythmic chopping of a knife against a marble cutting board. Lauren and Trent were in the kitchen, preparing an expensive breakfast. I heard the sharp, distinctive chime of Lauren's cell phone receiving my text message. There was a brief pause. I heard Lauren set down a glass. Then she burst into a loud, bright, and incredibly cruel fit of laughter. It was a sound that would have shattered my heart just a week ago, but now it only hardened the solid iron resolve in my chest. Trent asked her what was so funny. Lauren read my text message out loud to him, mocking my sincere and desperate tone. She deliberately deepened her voice, mimicking my southern blue-collar accent, making me sound like a pathetic and uneducated beggar pleading for a scrap of attention. Trent joined in the laughter. His arrogant and polished voice echoed through the hidden microphone. He proudly boasted to his wife that I was the easiest and most gullible target he had ever manipulated in his entire life. He laughed about how I was completely willing to bankrupt my own miserable future just to buy a few minutes of their time at a country club party. Then Victoria Caldwell walked into the kitchen. I heard the clicking of her expensive heels on the hardwood floor. Lauren eagerly showed her mother-in-law the text message. Victoria let out a sophisticated and condescending sigh. She told Lauren that it was actually a brilliant stroke of luck. Victoria explained that having me show up at the Bon Voyage party to hand over a massive check in front of Trent's former colleagues would project the perfect image of massive generational wealth. It would make them look incredibly successful right before they fled the country to escape federal prosecution. Victoria told Lauren to text me back immediately to play the part of a forgiving daughter and to secure that final $42,000 for their offshore accounts. A few seconds later, my phone vibrated on the kitchen table. It was Lauren. Her response was sickeningly sweet. She wrote that she would love for me to come to the party on Friday night. She told me to wear something nice and that she was so incredibly happy that I was finally acting like a supportive father. I took the heavy headphones off my ears and set them down on the table. They had completely swallowed the bait. They were so blinded by their own limitless greed and their absolute contempt for my blue-collar life that they did not suspect a single thing. They genuinely believed I was walking into their lavish party as a broken and submissive cash cow. They had absolutely no idea they were inviting a federal wrecking ball right through their front doors. I stood up from the table and immediately drove downtown to Rebecca Cross's law office. When I walked into the sterile glass conference room, Rebecca was not alone. Sitting across from her were two serious men wearing dark, immaculately tailored suits. They were special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the Complex Financial Crimes Division. Thomas, the forensic accountant, had forwarded the massive file of forged mortgage documents and offshore routing numbers directly to their field office the night before. The lead agent, a tall and intense man named Agent Miller, stood up and shook my hand. His grip was firm and respectful. He did not look at my grease-stained fingers with the elite disgust that the Caldwell family constantly projected. He looked at me like a crucial asset in a major federal takedown. Agent Miller explained the exact legal situation. The FBI had already independently verified the fraudulent notary stamp used by Preston Caldwell on my second mortgage. They had tracked the stolen $250,000 as it moved through Victoria's offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, exactly as Thomas had discovered. Furthermore, the Bureau had been quietly investigating Trent Caldwell for months regarding the massive embezzlement from his former wealth management firm. My concrete evidence was the absolute final nail in their collective coffin. The federal authorities were ready to move, and they wanted to move with overwhelming and devastating force. Rebecca Cross leaned across the polished mahogany table and laid out the operational strategy. She explained that arresting them quietly at their townhouse on a Thursday morning would give their high-priced defense lawyers time to scramble Hyde assets and control the public narrative. The FBI needed to catch all three of the primary conspirators together in the exact same room to prevent them from coordinating a cover story. They needed to seize their personal electronics, their passports, and their travel documents simultaneously before they could board a first-class flight to Dubai and escape American jurisdiction forever. I looked Agent Miller dead in the eye and told him exactly where they were going to be on Friday night. I explained the lavish Bon Voyage party they were hosting at the Caldwell family's exclusive country club. I told the agents that Trent, Preston, Victoria, and Lauren would all be standing together in the grand ballroom, drinking expensive champagne, and bragging to the entire city about their massive wealth. Agent Miller's eyes lit up with a cold, calculated satisfaction. He agreed that a coordinated federal raid at the country club was the absolute perfect tactical environment. The local police department would secure the perimeter and block the massive iron gates to prevent any vehicles from escaping. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit would sweep the grand ballroom and execute the federal arrest warrants in front of 300 high society guests. It would be a total inescapable and highly publicized dismantling of the Caldwell Empire. But I had one very specific and non-negotiable condition before I agreed to coordinate the timing of the raid. I looked at Rebecca and the federal agents and told them that I needed to be the one to initiate the sequence. I told them that I had promised to deliver a $42,000 cashier check to my daughter. I wanted to walk right through the front doors of that exclusive country club. I wanted to look my daughter and her arrogant husband in the eye. I wanted to hand them the envelope myself, and I wanted to be the very last thing they saw before their entire fake reality collapsed into federal prison sentences. Agent Miller studied my face for a long, silent moment. He saw the pure, unyielding iron resolve burning in my eyes. He nodded his head slowly and agreed to the terms. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously synchronizing the strike. We mapped out the blueprints of the country club, established a secure communication channel, and timed the exact moment the tactical teams would breach the ballroom doors. I drove back to my modest Charlotte home late on Thursday evening. The Carolina sky was completely pitch black, filled with a heavy, suffocating humidity that signaled an approaching summer storm. My house was completely silent. It was a deep, haunting silence that usually filled me with agonizing sorrow, but tonight it just felt like the necessary quiet before a massive explosion. I walked down the hallway into the living room and stood in front of the wooden mantel above the fireplace. I looked at the polished urn holding Diane's ashes. I picked up the framed photographs of Lauren that were scattered across the shelves. Pictures of her as a smiling toddler with missing front teeth. Pictures of her wearing a bright yellow dress at her high school graduation. Pictures of the beautiful, innocent girl who used to run into my grease-stained arms without a single ounce of shame. I carefully placed every single photograph inside a cardboard box and closed the lid. I did not want Diane's memory to witness the absolute ugliness of what was going to happen tomorrow night. And I did not want to look at the ghost of the daughter I used to have. That sweet little girl was completely dead and gone, murdered by her own limitless greed and completely replaced by a ruthless, calculating monster wearing a designer dress. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I bypassed the tailored rented tuxedo that I had paid so much money for just a few weeks ago. I bypassed my clean, respectable Sunday suits and my light blue button-down shirts. I reached all the way into the very back of the dark closet and pulled out my heavy-duty dark blue mechanic coveralls. The thick canvas fabric was permanently stained with dark patches of diesel oil transmission fluid and heavy black grease. The name tag stitched over the left breast pocket simply read, "Hal" in faded yellow thread. These coveralls represented 40 long years of breaking my back on hard concrete floors. They represented the grueling, toxic, and exhausting labor that had fully paid for the very same house the Caldwell family had just stolen from me. Lauren had explicitly banned me from her wedding chapel because she claimed my rough blue collar aesthetic was a massive embarrassment to her pristine social circle. She was deeply ashamed of the dirt on my clothes and the grease trapped under my fingernails. She wanted me to disappear into the shadows like a pathetic, forgotten peasant, so she could play the role of a wealthy elite. I laid the heavy canvas coveralls flat across the foot of my bed. Tomorrow night, I was not going to hide in the shadows. I was not going to put on a rented suit and pretend to be someone I was not. I was going to walk straight into the brightest, most exclusive room in the entire city, wearing the exact uniform of the labor they so viciously despised. I was going to wear my blue-collar pride like a suit of heavy steel armor. I went into my small home office and printed out a massive high-resolution full-color photograph of the forged second mortgage document bearing Preston Caldwell's fraudulent notary stamp. I printed thick stacks of the certified financial routing numbers proving their offshore accounts. I printed verbatim transcripts of the audio recordings where they laughed about leaving me completely homeless. I folded these damning documents perfectly and slid them into a crisp, white, high-quality bank envelope. It was the exact same size and shape as the envelope that would hold a $42,000 cashier check. I sealed the flap with a steady, unyielding hand. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was wrapped. The federal authorities were locked and loaded. The Caldwell family thought they had successfully slaughtered a weak and helpless sheep. They had absolutely no idea that tomorrow night they were going to wake up the wolves. Friday evening arrived with a heavy and suffocating humidity that settled thick over the city of Charlotte. The sky bruised into deep shades of purple and black as I parked my old rusty Ford truck across the street from the massive iron gates of the Caldwell Family Country Club. This was the exact same patch of dirt where I had parked just a few short weeks ago. It was the exact same spot where I had sat in the driver's seat and wept like a broken fool after my own daughter banned me from her wedding chapel. But tonight, the cab of my truck was completely silent. There were absolutely no tears left inside me. My chest felt like a solid, heavy block of iron. I sat behind the steering wheel and stared through the windshield at the glowing golden lights of the massive clubhouse in the distance. I could clearly see the long line of imported luxury cars pulling up to the valet stand. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a live jazz band floating on the warm night breeze. The Caldwell family was throwing a massive catered farewell party, a grand and opulent bon voyage gala to celebrate their upcoming permanent relocation to Dubai. They were drinking premium imported champagne and laughing with their wealthy friends about their brilliant escape. And they were funding every single drop of that expensive liquor with the stolen equity of my home. I turned off the rumbling diesel engine and reached over to the passenger seat. I picked up my heavy, dark blue mechanic coveralls. The thick canvas fabric was stiff with years of dried transmission fluid and permanently stained with dark patches of black grease. I did not go to a formal shop to put on a rented tuxedo tonight. I did not stand over my bathroom sink scrubbing the deep dirt out from under my fingernails with harsh pumice soap. I slipped the heavy canvas coveralls on right over my daily street clothes. I pulled the heavy brass zipper all the way up to my collar. I wanted the Caldwell family to see exactly who they had robbed. I wanted the arrogant elite of this city to look at the permanent grease stains on my chest and understand that their pristine high society lives were built entirely on the broken backs of hard-working blue-collar men. I grabbed the crisp white bank envelope containing the forged mortgage documents, the offshore banking routing numbers, and the printed audio transcripts. I slid the thick package carefully into the deep front pocket of the coveralls. I stepped out of the truck into the muggy evening air and walked straight toward the main gates. The private security guards standing at the front checkpoint took one single look at my grease-stained uniform and immediately stepped forward to block my path. They crossed their arms and firmly demanded to know what a dirty mechanic was doing trying to enter a private country club gala. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice or cause a chaotic scene. I simply looked the lead security guard dead in the eye and told him in a calm, steady voice that I was the father of the guest of honor. I told him I was personally invited by Lauren Caldwell to deliver a very large and highly anticipated financial gift for her luxury honeymoon. The guard hesitated. He looked down at the thick white bank envelope sticking out of my canvas pocket. The sheer blinding arrogance of the Caldwell family worked perfectly in my favor at that exact moment. They were so incredibly confident in my pathetic submission that they had actually put my name on the approved guest list at the gate. The guard muttered something into his shoulder. Radio nodded his head reluctantly, and stepped aside to let me pass right through the towering iron gates. I walked up the long, sweeping paved driveway and pushed open the massive polished wooden double doors of the main clubhouse. The grand ballroom inside was absolutely breathtaking. It was a cavernous and spectacular space filled with glittering crystal chandeliers hanging from the high vaulted ceilings. There were towering, extravagant arrangements of imported white orchids on every single table. A dozen waiters dressed in crisp white jackets circulated smoothly through the massive crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with bubbling champagne flutes and expensive gourmet appetizers. There were at least 300 guests packed into the room. Men in custom-tailored designer suits and women draped in elegant evening gowns. In the very center of the room, holding court like absolute royalty among the local elite, were Trent Preston and Victoria Caldwell. My daughter Lauren was standing right beside them, wearing a stunning emerald green silk dress and a glittering diamond necklace that I knew in my gut was paid for with my stolen retirement funds. I walked straight into the bright center of the ballroom. My heavy steel-toed work boots echoed loudly against the polished marble floor with a heavy, unyielding, rhythmic thud. One by one, the wealthy guests turned their heads to look at me. The polite, sophisticated conversations began to rapidly die out across the room. A rising wave of disgusted and confused whispers rippled through the massive crowd as they stared at the grease-stained mechanic invading their pristine sanctuary. The live jazz band playing on the raised wooden stage noticed the sudden commotion and slowly stopped playing their instruments. The sudden dead silence that fell over the massive ballroom was incredibly deafening. Victoria Caldwell spotted me from across the room. Her plastic, sophisticated socialite smile instantly melted away, replaced by a tight, rigid mask of pure aristocratic rage. She marched directly toward me with her expensive heels clicking sharply and aggressively against the marble floor. Trent and Lauren followed closely behind her, their faces reflecting a mixture of arrogant amusement and elite embarrassment. Victoria stopped just a few feet away from me and looked me up and down with absolute, unfiltered revulsion. She hissed under her breath, keeping her voice low so her wealthy friends would not hear her losing her temper. She demanded to know what on earth I was wearing and what I was doing ruining her flawless farewell party with my filthy aesthetic. She signaled frantically to a pair of large security guards standing near the catering tables, ordering them with sharp hand gestures to physically remove me from the building immediately. I did not even look at Victoria. I completely ignored her aggressive demands and her frantic signals. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my daughter. I walked straight past Victoria, ignoring the security guards moving in from the perimeter, and stepped confidently up onto the raised wooden bandstand. The jazz musicians backed away nervously as I approached. I reached out with my calloused hand and grabbed the heavy silver microphone from the center metal stand. I turned around and looked out over the vast sea of shocked and disgusted faces. 300 of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the entire city were staring up at me in absolute total silence. I held the microphone close to my mouth and my voice boomed through the massive concert speakers echoing heavily off the crystal chandeliers above. I announced my full name to the silent room. I told the massive crowd that I was Harold Jenkins and that I had spent 40 long years of my life working as a heavy diesel mechanic. I stated proudly that I was also the father of the beautiful young woman, wearing the emerald dress Lauren Caldwell. I looked down into the front row and saw Trent smirking smugly. He leaned over and whispered something into Preston's ear, covering his mouth to hide his cruel laughter. They genuinely thought I was standing up on that stage to make a pathetic, broken, emotional speech. They fully believed I was about to publicly beg for my daughter's conditional affection and eagerly hand over the absolute last remaining scraps of my life savings just to earn a single smile from her. Lauren stepped forward to the very edge of the wooden stage. Her eyes were fixed hungrily on the deep pocket of my canvas coveralls. She put on a flawless, fake, sweet smile for the watching crowd, playing the perfect role of the loving and forgiving daughter. She looked up at me and softly asked if I had brought the cashier check for her luxury honeymoon in Dubai, just like I had promised in my text message. I looked down at the child I had raised entirely on my own, with my own 2 bare hands. I looked at the woman who had coldly and casually laughed on a hidden audio recording about leaving me completely homeless and destitute on the streets. I searched my heart, and I did not feel a single solitary ounce of pity or hesitation. I reached my heavy hand into the grease-stained pocket of my canvas coveralls. I pulled out the crisp white bank envelope. The envelope was thick and heavy in my palm. It looked exactly like it held a certified bank draft for $42,000. I stepped slowly down the wooden stairs from the stage and walked directly up to Lauren. I held the sealed envelope out to her. I looked her dead in the eye and told her in a perfectly calm voice that this envelope contained absolutely everything she truly deserved. Lauren eagerly snatched the envelope from my calloused fingers. Trent stepped up very close behind her, placing a proud and possessive hand on her bare shoulder. Victoria and Preston leaned in closely with bright, greedy anticipation shining in their eyes. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to witness the massive and generous financial gift from the submissive father. Lauren frantically tore open the sealed paper flap of the envelope. She reached her perfectly manicured fingers inside and pulled out the thick stack of folded papers. But there was no certified cashier check for a luxury Dubai vacation inside. There was absolutely no money at all. Lauren unfolded the very first piece of heavy paper. It was a massive high-resolution color photograph of the fraudulent second mortgage contract. At the very bottom of the printed page, blown up to 5 times its normal size, so the ink was perfectly legible, was the sloppy forged signature bearing my name right next to the official blue state notary stamp belonging exclusively to Preston Caldwell. Lauren stared at the piece of paper in total absolute confusion, her mind unable to process what she was looking at. Trent impatiently snatched the thick document right out of her hands. The exact moment his arrogant eyes recognized the highly illegal real estate paperwork, his face went completely ghost white. The smug, corporate smile instantly vanished from his lips, entirely replaced by a look of absolute paralyzing and suffocating terror. Lauren kept pulling more papers out of the thick white envelope with shaking hands. She pulled out the certified banking routing numbers provided by the forensic accountant, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Victoria Caldwell had actively laundered $250,000 of my stolen home equity through hidden offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. She pulled out the official wire transfer authorization form bearing her own authentic signature, proving she had actively and willingly participated in stealing the stolen money to fund her extravagant luxury vacation. And finally, she pulled out the verbatim printed transcripts of the audio recordings I had captured from the hidden micro recorders inside their upscale townhouse. The detailed transcripts where they explicitly plotted to flee the country, avoid federal prosecution, and let my paid-off house go into permanent bank foreclosure. The heavy stack of papers slipped entirely from Lauren's trembling hands and scattered violently across the polished marble floor of the country club. She looked up at me with wide, terrified, and desperate eyes. In that exact moment, she finally realized that the blind, submissive, and pathetic father she thought she was expertly manipulating did not exist anymore. She realized that the supposedly stupid and uneducated diesel mechanic had systematically hunted them down and completely dismantled their entire criminal enterprise from the inside out. Preston realized the catastrophic gravity of the situation first. The slick and calculating real estate attorney physically backed away from his family, his eyes darting frantically toward the rear exit doors of the grand ballroom like a trapped rat looking for a sewer grate. Victoria let out a short, sharp, gasping breath, clutching her expensive diamond necklace as if she were suddenly choking on the humid Carolina air. I stepped much closer to them, closing the physical distance until I was standing right in their space. The silver microphone was still gripped tightly in my right hand. I lowered it away from my mouth so only the Caldwell family could hear my final words before the absolute storm broke over their heads. I looked Trent dead in his terrified eyes and told him that a man who works with his hands for 40 years knows exactly how to identify a fatal structural weakness in a broken machine. I turned my head to Victoria and told her that all her generational wealth and country club connections could not buy her way out of massive federal wire fraud. And then I looked directly at my daughter. I told Lauren that she had willingly traded a father who would have gladly died for her, for a family of cowardly thieves who were about to lose absolutely everything they possessed. I told them to enjoy their final glass of champagne because their luxury flight to Dubai was permanently cancelled. Trent Caldwell was not a man accustomed to losing. He had spent his entire adult life coasting on his family name, his custom-tailored suits and the arrogant belief that the rules applying to normal, hard-working people simply did not apply to him. When he looked down at the forged mortgage document scattered across the polished marble floor of the country club, his initial paralyzing terror instantly mutated into a blind and violent rage. The pristine corporate mask melted right off his face. He realized in a fraction of a second that the dumb, uneducated mechanic he had mocked and robbed had completely outsmarted him. Trent let out a guttural sound of pure fury. He lunged forward with his hands outstretched, aiming directly for my throat. Preston Caldwell was right behind him. The slick real estate attorney dropped all his polished legal composure the absolute moment he saw his own fraudulent notary stamp blown up on that printed photograph. Panic and anger took over his rational mind. Both of these wealthy, privileged men rushed at me with murder in their eyes, desperately trying to silence the man who had just destroyed their entire fake empire. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I had spent 4 decades wrestling massive engine blocks and tightening heavy steel bolts on freight trains. My body was built on calluses and enduring pain. I braced my boots against the marble floor, fully prepared to let them break their manicured hands against my jaw. But they never even got the chance to touch me. Before Trent could close the final 2 feet between us, the towering wooden doors of the grand ballroom burst completely open. The heavy brass handles slammed against the walls with a thunderous crack that echoed over the dead silence of the room. The local police officers and the federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division poured into the room like a tidal wave of dark blue and black. They moved with a terrifying and coordinated efficiency. Their heavy tactical boots pounded against the pristine marble floor, instantly drowning out the soft classical music that had been playing just minutes before. Agent Miller led the charge. His voice cut through the humid air of the ballroom with absolute, undisputed authority. He ordered everyone to freeze and remain exactly where they were standing. The 300 high society guests who had been drinking premium, imported champagne, and eating expensive catered food began to scream and scatter in absolute panic. Women in designer evening gowns backed away in horror. Men in expensive tuxedos raised their hands, desperate to show the federal authorities they had absolutely nothing to do with the criminal family standing in the center of the room. The wealthy elite of Charlotte were watching their most exclusive sanctuary being completely overrun by the consequences of absolute greed. Trent Caldwell saw the federal windbreakers, and his false courage instantly evaporated. The man who had boasted on hidden microphones about fleeing to Dubai without a single consequence turned and tried to run. He shoved past his own wife and sprinted toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. He barely made it 10 feet. 2 local police officers tackled him from behind. The heavy impact sent Trent crashing violently onto the hard marble floor. The sound of his custom Italian suit tearing open echoed sharply. One officer drove his knee deep into Trent's back, pinning him firmly to the ground, while the other officer violently twisted his arms behind his back. The cold steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, with a heavy and satisfying finality. Agent Miller stood directly over Trent. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and read the charges out loud for the entire ballroom to hear. He announced that Trent Caldwell was being placed under federal arrest for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. Trent stopped fighting the officers. He pressed his face against the cold floor and began to sob. He cried like a broken child, whining that it was all a massive misunderstanding, begging his wealthy friends in the crowd to call his lawyers. But the crowd just stared at him with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The man who had ruined so many innocent lives to pay his gambling debts was finally tasting the dirt. Preston Caldwell did not try to run. He knew the law well enough to know that running from federal agents would only add years to his inevitable prison sentence, but his arrogant pride still refused to die. When 2 federal agents approached him, Preston raised his hands and put on his slick, professional attorney voice. He tried to speak calmly, claiming that he was a licensed officer of the court and that they were making a catastrophic jurisdictional error. He demanded to see the warrant and threatened to sue the entire federal bureau for defamation. The agents did not even blink. One of them grabbed Preston by the shoulder, spun him around roughly, and slammed him face first against a towering table of imported white orchids. The expensive crystal vases shattered everywhere, raining water and flower petals all over Preston's expensive gray suit. The agent snapped the handcuffs onto his wrists and leaned in close to his ear. He informed Preston that he was under arrest for severe notary fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The agent specifically mentioned that they had already secured the fraudulent notary stamp from his brother's desk drawer. Preston's slick legal jargon instantly died in his throat. His face went completely pale. He realized his law degree was completely useless against concrete evidence, and his entire prestigious career was permanently over. Victoria Caldwell was standing near the edge of the wooden bandstand. The grand matriarch of the elite Caldwell family was watching her 2 precious sons being hauled off the floor in steel chains. Her perfectly styled hair was coming undone. She tried to maintain her aristocratic composure. She stood perfectly straight, clutching her expensive designer purse, and put on a mask of absolute offended dignity. When a female federal agent approached her with handcuffs drawn, Victoria actually scoffed. She looked the agent up and down with elite condescension and ordered the woman not to touch her. She loudly proclaimed that she was a personal friend of the city mayor and that this entire raid was a ridiculous peasant misunderstanding. The female agent did not care about the mayor. She grabbed Victoria by the wrists with a firm, unyielding grip. Victoria let out a sharp gasp of shock as the heavy steel cuffs were locked tightly over the sleeves of her silk designer gown. Agent Miller walked over and looked the arrogant woman dead in the eye. He informed Victoria Caldwell that she was being arrested for international money laundering and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He loudly stated that the Federal Bureau had already frozen her hidden offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. That was the exact moment Victoria completely broke. The realization that her secret overseas money was gone destroyed her fake dignity. She looked around the ballroom at her wealthy country club peers. The people she had hosted dinner parties for and played tennis with were now whispering and pointing at her like she was a common street criminal. The absolute humiliation was too much for her fragile, elite ego. Victoria Caldwell collapsed to her knees in the middle of the ballroom, weeping hysterically and screaming that her life was ruined. The agents hauled her back to her feet without a single ounce of sympathy and marched her toward the front doors. I stood perfectly still in my heavy, grease-stained canvas coveralls and watched the entire Caldwell empire burn straight to the ground. It took less than 5 minutes. The arrogant, wealthy family that had planned to leave me homeless and bankrupt on the streets was now being frog-marched out of their own lavish party in chains. Then I slowly turned my head and looked at my daughter. Lauren was standing completely alone in the center of the shattered ballroom. The forged mortgage documents and the printed audio transcripts were still scattered around her expensive high heels. She was trembling violently from head to toe. She had just watched her wealthy husband, her slick brother-in-law, and her arrogant mother-in-law get hauled away to federal prison. She was left standing in her beautiful emerald green silk dress with absolutely nothing. An agent approached Lauren and asked for her identification, informing her that she was currently a primary person of interest in a massive ongoing financial conspiracy. He told her she was not allowed to leave the city limits and that her passport had been officially flagged and suspended. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on Lauren like a ton of heavy bricks. Trent's money was completely gone. The lavish 3-week luxury honeymoon in the underwater suite in Dubai was permanently cancelled. The beautiful upscale townhouse she lived in was going to be seized by the federal government as the product of wire fraud. She had absolutely no money, no powerful husband to protect her, and she was likely facing accessory charges that could put her behind bars. Her entire pristine high society dream had turned into an absolute nightmare. Lauren looked around the room with wild, desperate eyes. Her former country club friends were actively turning their backs on her, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal. She had absolutely no one left in the world. And then she looked at me. She stared at the grease-stained coveralls I was wearing, the exact same blue-collar uniform she had explicitly banned from her wedding chapel because she found it so incredibly embarrassing. But now, in her moment of total absolute ruin, I was the only familiar face left in the room. Her survival instincts kicked in. The cruel, calculating monster hiding behind the designer dress suddenly tried to play the role of the innocent victim one last time. Tears began to stream down her face. She took a step toward me and reached out with her trembling, manicured hands. She cried out my name. She called me Dad, in that soft, sweet voice she used to use when she was a little girl, asking for a new bicycle. She begged me to help her. She sobbed that Trent and Victoria had manipulated her mind, that she did not fully understand what they were doing with the mortgage, and that she was just a confused young woman who made a terrible mistake. She pleaded with me to use my money to hire a lawyer for her, promising that we could go back to being a happy family if I just saved her from the federal agents. I looked down at the hands reaching out to me. I remembered how those same hands had signed the official wire transfer forms to steal my life savings. I remembered how she had laughed brightly on the hidden audio recordings while Victoria joked about me living in a cheap retirement trailer park. I remembered the cruel text message where she held my future grandchildren hostage for $42,000. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The agonizing, suffocating heartbreak that had crushed my chest for weeks was completely gone. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream at her. I simply looked my only daughter dead in the eye with an expression of cold, solid iron. I told Lauren that she was a liar. I told her that I had heard every single word she said on those audio tapes. I stated calmly that she knew exactly what they were doing to me, and that she had actively celebrated my absolute destruction just to fund a vacation in the desert. I reminded her of the sacred deathbed promise I made to her mother. I told her that I had been fully prepared to sacrifice my home, my retirement, and my very life to make sure she was safe and happy. I was a father who would have gladly died for her without a single moment of hesitation. But then I delivered the final crushing truth. I told Lauren that she had willingly traded that unconditional love for a plastic family of arrogant thieves who only used her as a convenient pawn. She had traded a father who loved her soul for a husband who only loved her silence. I told her that blood does not excuse this magnitude of betrayal. She had made her choice when she sent that letter banning me from her wedding. She had chosen her side, and now she had to live in the exact hell she had helped create. Lauren dropped her hands. Her face went completely blank with absolute horrific realization. She finally understood that the well of my paternal forgiveness was permanently dry. She was completely and utterly on her own. I did not wait for her to speak another word. I turned my back on my daughter and began to walk away. I walked slowly and deliberately across the grand ballroom. My heavy steel-toed work boots echoed sharply against the marble floor with every single step. The crowd of wealthy elites, the people who had sneered at my calloused hands and faded clothes just 30 minutes ago, immediately parted like the Red Sea. They stepped out of my way in complete and absolute silence, looking at me with a profound mixture of shock and genuine respect. They realized that the old grease-stained diesel mechanic was the most dangerous and powerful man in the entire building. I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors of the main clubhouse and stepped out into the warm, humid Carolina night. The chaotic, flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the manicured lawns in bright, chaotic colors. I walked down the long paved driveway, past the stunned private security guards at the front gate, and crossed the street to where my old rusty Ford truck was parked in the dirt. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the heavy metal door. I looked at the framed photograph of my late wife Diane resting on the passenger seat. I reached out and gently touched the glass. I told her that the job was finally done. The machine had been completely dismantled. I turned the brass key in the ignition. The massive, heavy diesel engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. I put the truck in gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the flashing lights, the shattered country club, and the ruins of the Caldwell family completely behind me in the darkness. I drove back toward my modest home, knowing for the first time in weeks that I was going to sleep peacefully. Justice had been served cold, precise, and absolutely final. The loudest explosions in a man's life are always followed by the deepest and most profound silence. When the flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers finally disappeared down the long paved driveway of the country club, leaving the wealthy elite of Charlotte standing in absolute paralyzed shock, my world suddenly went completely quiet. The heavy, suffocating storm that had been violently raging inside my chest for weeks finally broke. The rain stopped. The dark clouds parted. And the grueling, meticulous work of cleaning up the massive wreckage officially began. The following months moved with a swift and ruthless efficiency that only the federal justice system can truly deliver when they have absolute concrete proof handed to them on a silver platter. Trent Caldwell was the very first to completely crumble under the crushing weight of the evidence. The arrogant junior wealth manager, who used to smirk at my faded flannel shirts and scuffed work boots, did not look so proud sitting in a sterile federal interrogation room. When the Financial Crimes Unit played the crystal-clear audio recordings of him boasting about his massive embezzlement and his grand plans to flee to Dubai, his expensive corporate lawyers immediately advised him to stop fighting. Trent took a blind plea deal in a desperate and pathetic attempt to save himself. He stood before a federal judge, wearing a shapeless orange jumpsuit instead of a custom-tailored Italian suit. He wept openly in the courtroom, begging for leniency. The judge did not show a single ounce of mercy. Trent was sentenced to 15 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There are no premium open bars or underwater luxury suites where he is going. There is only cold concrete and the agonizing daily reminder of the pristine life he threw away for pure greed. His older brother Preston did not fare any better. The slick and calculating real estate attorney tried to use every single legal loophole he had ever memorized to escape the jaws of justice. He tried to claim he was entirely ignorant of the massive conspiracy and that his fraudulent notary stamp had been stolen and misused. But my bulldog lawyer, Rebecca Cross, and the forensic accountant, Thomas, had built a cage so perfectly welded together that Preston could not find a single tiny crack to slip through. The federal prosecutors presented the thick stack of forged mortgage documents and the meticulous digital trail proving he deliberately bypassed the standard banking verification protocols. Preston was permanently disbarred. He was entirely stripped of his prestigious legal license in total disgrace. The judge handed him a 10-year federal prison sentence for severe notary fraud and criminal conspiracy. The two arrogant brothers who had laughed together on hidden microphones about leaving me completely homeless are now locked in separate federal facilities, permanently stripped of their wealth and their elite dignity. But the absolute most satisfying fall from grace belonged entirely to Victoria Caldwell. The grand matriarch of the snobby high society empire thought she was completely untouchable. She genuinely believed her elite social connections and her fancy country club memberships would miraculously shield her from the consequences of stealing $250,000 from a blue-collar mechanic. She was completely and utterly wrong. The moment the federal authorities traced the stolen equity of my home directly into her hidden offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands, her entire pristine world violently imploded. The government moved with terrifying speed. They officially seized her sprawling gated estate. They seized her luxury imported vehicles. They froze every single bank account tied to the Caldwell family name. Victoria was forced to stand in a public courtroom completely stripped of her designer gowns and her expensive diamond necklaces. She watched in absolute horror as the federal government liquidated her entire estate at public auction to pay back the massive debts her family had accumulated, and to restitute the victims of their elaborate wire fraud. The elite, wealthy friends who used to drink her imported champagne and attend her lavish dinner parties completely turned their backs on her. They pretended they had never even met her. They erased her from their social registry overnight. Victoria was convicted of international money laundering and conspiracy to commit massive wire fraud. She was sentenced to 8 years in a federal women's correctional facility. The woman who refused to shake my calloused hand because she thought my working-class life was an infectious disease is now learning exactly what it means to live at the absolute bottom of the social barrel. And then there was Lauren, my only daughter. The beautiful child I had raised entirely on my own after my wife Diane passed away. The little girl I had secretly mortgaged my fully paid-off home for just to give her the grand luxury wedding she begged for. Because Lauren actively cooperated with the federal authorities after her arrest, and because she had absolutely no prior criminal record, the judge decided to show her a small sliver of mercy. She narrowly avoided a federal prison sentence. Instead, she was handed 5 years of incredibly strict supervised probation. But avoiding a steel cage did not mean she escaped her punishment. Her true punishment is the absolute crushing reality of the new life she is forced to live every single day. The beautiful upscale townhouse she shared with Trent was officially seized and repossessed by the federal government. The massive bank accounts were permanently frozen and drained. Her elite, snobby friends from the country club completely ostracized her, treating her like an absolute pariah. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and the heavy, agonizing weight of her own criminal choices. Today, my daughter lives in a tiny run-down studio apartment on the absolute worst side of the city. She takes the public bus before the sun even comes up. And the bitter irony of the universe is something to truly behold. The woman who explicitly banned her own father from her wedding chapel because she was deeply ashamed of my blue-collar aesthetic is now surviving on a minimum wage job. She works the early morning shift as a waitress at a cheap local discount diner. She spends her days wiping down sticky tables and serving greasy plates of bulk food to tired truck drivers and exhausted mechanics who look exactly like me. She wanted to be a high society queen in Dubai, but her limitless greed turned her into a ghost haunting a cheap roadside diner. I do not call her. I do not visit her. I do not check on her. The sacred paternal bond that tethered my heart to hers was violently and permanently severed the exact moment I heard her laughing on that hidden audio recording about my upcoming homelessness. She made her calculated choice, and now she must serve her time in the purgatory she built with her own two hands. While the Caldwell family was being systematically dismantled by the justice system, I sat in the quiet, sterile glass office of my attorney, Rebecca Cross. We were sitting across from David, my longtime bank branch manager. David looked at me with deep, sincere apologies in his eyes. He handed me a thick stack of freshly printed official documents. The legal resolution was swift and absolute. Because Preston's criminal convictions proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the second mortgage was a massive forgery, the bank's title insurance completely covered the fraudulent debt. The $250,000 lien against my property was entirely nullified and permanently erased from the public record. But Rebecca did not stop there. She was a legal predator who fought for absolute total victory. She successfully argued that the original $100,000 cashier check I had given Trent for the fake luxury caterers was obtained under criminal false pretenses and was part of the larger embezzlement conspiracy. Through the aggressive liquidation of Victoria Caldwell's massive estate, the federal court ordered full financial restitution. The bank wiped my original mortgage completely clean. I walked out of that downtown bank building and drove my old rusty Ford truck back to my quiet residential neighborhood. I walked up the concrete steps of my modest house. I turned the familiar brass key in the front door and stepped inside. The air was cool and peaceful. I walked down the hallway and stood in the center of my living room, looking up at the polished wooden urn resting on the mantel holding Diane's ashes. I touched the cold brass nameplate, and I smiled. The house was fully restored to me. It belonged to me free and clear, exactly as it had before this entire nightmare began. The crushing, agonizing anxiety of losing the only home I had ever known was completely gone. I had protected the walls where my wife and I had built our lives. I had defended our legacy from the absolute worst kind of thieves. Right now, I am standing in my small, detached garage. The heavy scent of motor oil and old metal hangs thick in the warm Carolina air. I am holding a faded red shop rag in my hands, wiping away the thick black diesel grease that has settled deep into the calluses of my palms. For decades, I viewed this grease as a simple mark of honest, grueling labor. But after everything I have survived, I now look at my rough hands, and I see the exact weapons that tore down a corrupt and arrogant empire. I want you to listen to me very carefully, because the lesson I paid for in blood and heartbreak is something you must carry with you for the rest of your life. We are taught from a very young age that evil always wears a terrifying mask. We are taught that monsters hide in dark alleys and carry weapons. But the most dangerous evil in this world does not hide in the shadows. Sometimes evil wears a custom-tailored Italian suit. It drives an expensive imported luxury car. It lives behind towering iron gates in pristine, manicured neighborhoods. It drinks vintage champagne, and it uses polite, sophisticated manners and slick legal jargon to mask a soul that is completely black with absolute greed. Never let anyone convince you that wealth and social status equal basic human decency. And more importantly, never let the heavy biological concept of family blind you to the absolute truth standing right in front of your eyes. Blood does not excuse betrayal. Sharing a last name does not give anyone the right to use you as a disposable financial asset. It does not give them the permission to manipulate your love to bleed you completely dry. You are not required to lay down and quietly accept your own destruction simply because the person holding the knife is your own flesh and blood. If you have spent your entire life breaking your back to build a safe home and a secure future, you have a sacred obligation to protect it. You must stand up tall. You must gather your strength. You must use your intelligence and your absolute unyielding patience to build an iron cage around those who try to steal your peace. You must fight back smarter and harder, even if it means tearing down the very people you love the most. True justice requires a calloused pair of hands and a heart that refuses to be broken. If my story resonated with you today, and if you believe that absolute justice was served to the Caldwell family, I want to hear your voice. Please hit the like button on this video right now to show your support for a father who refused to be a victim. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of hard-earned justice. And please go down to the comments section right now and tell me your current location and exactly what time it is where you are watching this video. Whether you are drinking your morning coffee on the East Coast or winding down late at night on the other side of the world, I promise you that I sit in this garage and I personally read every single comment you leave. Your words bring this old mechanic an incredible amount of joy, and it reminds me that good, honest people still exist in every corner of this earth. Stay strong, my friends. Keep your eyes open, trust your instincts, and always, absolutely always protect what you have built. I will see you in the next story.